Good afternoon, everybody. I will start the fifth session of this conference. My name is Eran Mordohovic. I'm from Israel, ICOMOS Israel. Actually, I'm with two hats in this event. I'm also part of the Erich Mendelsohn initiative because I once researched Erich Mendelsohn and the work of him is dear to me. And also I'm representing ICOMOS Israel as an organization which is very concerned and with the protection of Mendelssohn heritage in Israel and all over the world, as well as with promotion of world heritage and heritage at large. I will use my executive priority position now to fill the gap of yesterday misfortune with the presentation in the beginning. And I think it's very important to illustrate what I tried to say yesterday about the need for this kind of initiative and finally the need to proceed and finally create this extra layer of protection. And I bring very quickly the case of the Schocken house, which was mentioned here and there, as an example for how can it end, or how it ends, even when there is a legal protection, but it's not strong enough and there is not this international layer of protection. So this is the Schocken villa, the second private house Mendelsohn designed in Israel for his long and faithful client Zalman Schocken. As you can see, it's located in a neighborhood which was not developed yet, and Mendelsohn designed a wonderful garden around the lot, which actually consisted of 6 different lots, a very big site. To say the truth, the family Schocken lived in this house perhaps 2 full years, maybe not even that. So the building was used mostly not as a house, but later on as all kind of different uses of this wonderful house, which was actually more a public house than a private house, with a swimming pool and other innovations which were quite pioneering for buildings in Palestine at that time. And this is a situation today after, let's say, 70 years of deforming and additions and misuse of the building, including blocking the swimming pool, building other buildings on the garden. And the garden, of course, was part of Mendelssohn total design. So, and here other additions which were made on top of the building. And if we see the situation today, all those buildings were added there on the 80s, on the garden itself, where it is marked with red. And also there are, from the 50s, other additions in red on the building itself and adjacent to it, which completely deformed the building, but on the other end created a new function, which was a music academy for decades. And the proposal was in the beginning of the 2000 to actually demolish this whole villa and the addition which were added to it. And Rami Karmi, which was prominent Israeli architect, proposed a housing project on this lot, which did not mention at all the fact that it was a villa of Schocken. And after some public relation effort, he considered and proposed to reconstruct the facade of the back facade on the front facade of this housing complex, which was, of course, a real, I would say, ridiculous proposal, and not only for conservation people. So we have a collection of houses and buildings of Mendelssohn in Jerusalem, and one of the ideas in the beginning of the year 2000 was that with kind of nomination for the World Heritage, those buildings might be protected as a serial site. And that didn't happen until now, and it's not like that now. But with this initiative, we hope that some of the buildings which still bear authenticity, integrity, and all the outstanding universal values as we see them now with this initiative, we hope that this some of those buildings will be added to a potential list. So from after this big campaign in the years about 7 years ago, a new proposal came up which said we'll take off all the additions, but we have to add a tower of housing in order to finance this project and to profit. Now it belongs to a private owner, and that was a proposal which was finally approved in the municipality of Jerusalem and in the regional Jerusalem committee, planning committee. Of course, this proposal deforms the building. When I was standing in front of the regional planning committee, I brought this example from another iconic building, and I explained them that actually the plan that which is proposed is suggesting first to block the ground floor and then to add the tower. I must say my explanations didn't really influence the final decision, and I couldn't convince them, not about Le Corbusier and for sure not about Mendelsohn. So thank you for this opportunity to show you in pictures why we need this initiative. I call this session the American session. So why American? Not only because of the topic which will be discussed. Two of the lectures are speaking about Mendelsohn and his influence on the architectural history, in particular in America, or in relations to American architects. But because the three speakers we have come from the Americas, North America and South America. So this is the American session. And I will first invite Dr. Anat Falbel. She's from Brazil. She's born in Israel, by the way, so there is another connection. She's from Brazil. I will introduce Anat, and then we'll go for your lecture. Anat Falbel received her PhD in architecture and urbanism from the University of Sao Paulo in 2003 with the thesis Lucian Korngold, The Trajectory of an Immigrant Architect, dealing with the subject of immigrant architects between the 14th and the 16th in Sao Paulo. The Canadian Center of Architecture Visiting Scholar in 2013. Presently, she's one of the organizers of the Urban Representation EHAN interest group, an editorial member of the Cahiers de Recherche Architectural Urbanisme and Pièces Gérées. I'm sorry for my French, it's not perfect. She was the, probably it's in Portuguese, no? French. She was a curator of the exhibitions Exile and Modernity, very relevant to our subject, the space of foreigners in the city of Sao Paulo, and the Vagabond Stars, Memories of the Jewish Theater in Brazil. In addition to her publications dedicated to the field of architecture and photography, she has also edited in Brazil the books Bruno Sevi, Arquitectura e Judaismo, Mendelsohn and Joseph Reichert, The House of Adam in Paradise, The Idea of the City, and The Dancing Column. So, 20 minutes, have fun.
Thank you, Eran, and I'm beginning with a special thanks to the strong and super effective feminine team involved in the okay. So I have to thank the feminine team, the special feminine team involved in the organization of this event. You are feeling the atmosphere you prepared. And I'm beginning with, during the interwar period, Mendelsohn's outstanding building assignments were the object of recognition and the European modern, amid the European modern circles, the architectural press and the milieu of architectural criticism. Nevertheless, his exile in 1933, the architect's displacements, the silence of the first narratives of modern architecture regarding in Gideon's Space and Time and Architecture consecutive editions, including the fate of this first major retrospective at MoMA, was traumatic for the architect. However, since the second post-war, historians of different generations and agendas have sought to respond to the crisis of the discipline, recovering the German architect's trajectory. This presentation proposed a discussion on one of these inflection points between the middle 50s and 60s, already forecast by John Summerson, considering two different cultural milieus. The English architectural circles around the Architectural Review, focusing on Nicolas Pevsner, and the Italian debate animated by Bruno Zevi. And I'm starting inside the English circles that revolved around the Architectural Review with Nicolas Pevsner's intriguing introduction to the English edition of Mendelssohn Correspondence compiled by Bayer in 1961, in which the historian advanced the revision of both the structure and hypotheses of his original pioneers of modern architecture. The whole of my pioneers could be rewritten by someone now, and I will no doubt soon be rewritten by someone of this generation, to which modern design means the very opposite of what it means to me. My book stops in 40, for I took it for granted that the style which Americans call the international style was established and would spread everywhere, remaining unchallenged. But it has been changed, and Ronshaw and Hans Scharoun Philharmonie in Berlin are in complete opposition to it. The history, which I expect will be written, would call Art Nouveau as the first climax, with Gaudí as the climax of the climax, would regret the rationalism of my pioneers and go straight on to the second climax, the Expressionism of 70s 23, the Amsterdam School, Mendelssohn's Eisenstein Tower, and Steiner's Gottenheim. The importance of Pevsner's statement should be understood considering his ascendancy in the architectural milieu in those same decades through his writings, the BBC conferences as a requested advisor, as well as for his lasting presence in the editorial committee of the Architectural Review. Indeed, Pevsner contributed to transforming the AR into a pluralist magazine, which since the middle 40s supported a humanized modernism that recognized both the vernacular roots of architecture and the picturesque representing the architectural functional tradition promoted by Pevsner, as well as the architectural movements of the first decades of the 20th century, those zones of science such as Futurism and Expressionism, and their main actors, with Erich Mendelsohn among them, were identified by Rainer Beinam in his doctorate, in which the English scholar matured his historical revisionism in confrontation with his advisor pioneers, and the testimonies of a number of German architects and artists desires still alive. To then propose the rewriting of the history of modern movement, justified not because the history was wrong, but because it was a skeletal history of the movement, and in this sense should be reestablished in the name of the, and I quote, enriching experience that the variety of aesthetics can offer. Hence, as recognized by Pevsner in 1966, Barnham's research and elaborations contributed to Pevsner's intellectual revision and new attention to the forms previously noted as fantastic runs or extravagance. Nevertheless, as shown by Boyd White, Pevsner's argument in the 60s were still anchored in his interwar elaborations, like the article Kunst und Staat, published in 1934, in which German Expressionism was perceived as the result of a political and cultural atmosphere, a transitional style, and I quote, from the world of liberalism to the new world of the 20th century. Pevsner resumed the same construction, suggesting that in the same way that Expressionism constitutes an interval between early works and made-to works, such as Gropius' Bauhaus building in the South, Corbusian, the 20s Corbusian residence, or Mies Pavilion in Barcelona, the contemporary crisis of architecture could be translated as an intermission in which the belief in functionalism was again being replaced by the architect's individual expression and an easy originality achieved by borrowings from the expressions of the most recent past, such as Art Nouveau, Futurism, and Expressionism. Hence, Pevsner redeemed the old arguments used by the Sachlichkeit defenders against Expressionism and Mendelsohn himself to reaffirm the social responsibility of the individual and his role in the expression of the collective unconscious, the Kunstwollen of the period, in contrast to a creative personal force. And indeed, in the article published in Architectural Review in 1962, prompted by the German first edition of Mendelssohn's correspondence, the historian referred to Mendelssohn as an individualist, like Kandinsky and Picasso, suggesting that his drawings were void of any functional intent. In fact, on the contrary, one could identify Mendelssohn's elaborations on the balance between form and function, not only in the correspondence with Louise, but also in his writing and conferences, in which the German architect, together with friends Theo van Desburg and Adolf Benny, confronted Sachlichkeits architects like Mies on the issue of the building dual function, meaning both the practice and the proportionality and art to operate the relation between dynamics and function. Very much like Mendelssohn, Adolf Benny, author of the modern Zwickau, the functional building 26, a participant of the Expressionist circles and an active member of the Arbeitsstreit von Kunst, to which Mendelssohn also contributed, interpreted the concept of individualism differently from Pevsner, considering that, and I quote, absolute individualism is the most important driving force behind consistent functionalism. As a creator, he works from the whole to the individual or from the individual to the whole. While many reflections seem to anticipate the revision proposed by Gideon, Léger and Certes in 9 Points of Monumentality regarding the unity between building, landscape, and urban space, Mendelssohn's outburst in his last article appeared in the Architectural Forum in 1953, recognized affinities between his early sketches and the works of some contemporary architects based on what he defined as elastic continuity. In the Italian peninsula, the affinities recognized by Mendelsohn in the early 50s in Niemeyer's work were noted by, in 51 by philosopher and critic Gilles Doffles, while developing his concept of neo-Baroque, which incorporate expressionism. In fact, already in 1937, Walter Kurt Berendt had proposed analogies between the expressionist features observed in Hans Pelzig, Taut and Mendelssohn architecture and the Baroque architecture. Nevertheless, for Berendt, Mendelssohn was, and they quote, one of the most reinforced the decisionism. In 1952, writing with the privileged collaboration of Mendelssohn, another Italian already mentioned by and shown by Maristella, Spattererinnen? No, apparently not. Here, not. Okay, no problem. Thank you. Mario Federico Rogero published Il contributo di Mendelssohn all'evoluzione dell'architettura moderna. Rogero proposed three original approaches: the impact on the architect's design and theoretical work of his double character, meaning as a German and as a Jew, an argument that had already been outlined by Bruno Zevi in Storia dell'architettura moderna, but would gain more complexity in the 60s with Zevi's conceptualization of Mendelssohn among other intellectuals as the exiled or the other in the diaspora. Second, the problematic diffusion and appropriation of the architect's work in America confronted that had Gideon's silence as a backdrop. And third, the importance of recovering Mendelssohn design work in the face of the crisis of contemporary architecture. Both Doffles and Rogero were involved in the editorial project proposed by Zevi for Einaudi, which followed the theoretical elaboration of this later, started in 1945 with Verso un'architettura organica and the militant Storia dell'architettura moderna by 1950, leading the dissemination of organic architecture through the work of Frank Lloyd Wright in Italy. Zevi was also an early apologist of Mendelssohn's work and Expressionism. Indeed, Zevi started to work on Mendelssohn at the Columbia Library in his American exile. For him, Expressionism had broken with the academic and nationalist rigidity that formed the vocabulary of modern architecture, influencing the developments of contemporary language in the same way. In the post-war period, Frank Lloyd Wright's work was resumed. I'm sorry, I will pass. In the post-war period, Frank Lloyd Wright's work was resumed and operated from the same meanings pointed out in the 1930s by militants of Wrightian architecture like Persico. That is, as a representation of the ideal of freedom and democracy, architecture's independence from all external imposition. And here, one cannot fail to notice echoes of Benedetto Croce's elaboration of autonomy. Having as primary references the volumes of of Berendt and Gideon, Zevi suggested the repercussion of organic architecture through right in the forming of the modern European movement and its different expressions since before First World War. And using the same procedure already done with Expressionism, he proposed affinities between organic and contemporary architecture in the sense of a democratic and human architecture emancipated from codes and cliches. Therefore, Expressionism and the work of Mendelsohn were the key pieces in the Zevian historical project. The first, because it would have broken simultaneously with the academic and rationalist rigidity, and the second, because together with Corbusier, Gropius, Mies and Wood, Mendelsohn had operated in a personal way, as expressed by the Italian historian in his Storia dell'Architettura. And if the relationship between Wright and Mendelsohn had already been pointed out before, either by Persico in his essential lecture Profezia dell'Architettura, by Wittig in the first and second edition of his monograph on the German architect, or by Mendelsohn himself in the conference My Own Contribution to the Development of Contemporary Architecture, Zevi was most likely also responsible for promoting the 100 sketch exhibition that brought the drawings of the two architects together at the Venice Biennale in '60. The analysis of Mendelssohn's work allowed Zevi to discuss the arguments used by rationalists like Gideon and Pevsner to justify the exclusion of Mendelssohn production from the historiographical body of modern architecture, namely the concept of individualism, the search for ideal goals, as well as architecture as the representation of the collective soul. In Zevi's historical project, the value and character of Mendelssohn's rationalist work were in the direct relationship of their sources with the expressionist view, independent from geometric formalism, standardization, and the society that these last features represented. Zevi published his first long article dedicated to Mendelssohn in Metron. His next editorial initiative, L'Architettura Cronac Historia, published Mendelssohn's work systematically between 62 and 63, turning itself into a platform not only for the dissemination of the German architect production, but for other architects and projects outside the modern canon. And in 70s, the volume Erich Mendelsohn Opera Completa finally came to light. In Italy, Zevi's militancy provoked other initiatives that expanded in the 60s. The exhibition L'Expressionism in Florence, curated by Argan, Brandi, Buccarelli, Giovanni Klaus Konging. Soon after came to light the volume Architettura dell'Expressionismo, notwithstanding the author's resumption of some previous arguments as Mendelssohn's individualistic role within a network of Jewish entrepreneurs. He's been hostile to collective issues implicit in urban issues, and the topic of reclami language already elaborated by Barnham, but developed under the perspective of semiotics, which was suggested during this morning. Our time is up, I already know. I left in this silence fundamental works like Dennis Sharp. I cannot comment on the revisionism in Germany in the early 60s and how European and new historiography questions traversed the ocean. Still, I cannot conclude with mention Julius Posner, who took over the exhibition idealized by Oscar Bayer, that Zevi described as a traumatic experience, at the same time a dilemma and a challenge. As a conclusion, The last few decades have witnessed a succession of publications dedicated to the life and work of Erich Mendelsohn. The recovery can be understood in the multidisciplinarity of cultural transfer studies. Indeed, as Zevi once sensed, the character of this German architect of Jewish origins and the extension of his exile between three continents highlight the issue of dialogues and cultural exchanges, one of the main topics of contemporary architectural historiography, about which Mendelsohn himself prophesied in 1932, urging the intercultural dialogue as a path to transforming the world, a compelling message these days. In the world to come, nations will retain their uniqueness, but they will be consolidated in an international community. For new problems will affect all nations equally. National self-sufficiency as an ideal, a spiritual challenge. Nevertheless, we must be careful not to define the concept of nation too narrowly. And I conclude this time for real, by saying that as a seismograph, another one of Zevi's expression in the face of the numerous frustration with modern architectural criticism that accompanied his exile, Erich Mendelsohn maintained throughout his wanderings a clear awareness of the cultural atmosphere and the eternal dynamics of that criticism, as attested by his previous outburst in 1937. I place it at the discretion of that historical process that eliminates everything foreign to its normal state of health. Finished.
Thank you very much. So I didn't say it in the beginning, but Anat, please stay for questions. I didn't mention in the beginning, but we are in the section which it's not only the American session, but it's also which deals with Mendelssohn placement in architectural history, and actually all this conference is under the title of positioning Mendelssohn and his heritage in architecture history or in architecture at large, and therefore we are and also since we are we look in this conference, we look to the back to the history, but we also look to the future of Mendelssohn's heritage. It's a kind of with the eyes on the two direction. Therefore, I think it's important that we have this historical point of view and understanding how the criticism and the evolvement of the criticism over Mendelssohn worked, and many subjects which were discussed in the conference, like exile and globalism, and so they come out from more and more lectures, and it becomes into kind of a body of knowledge coming out from this conference. So, are there any questions for Anat from the audience? From the chat? No, I prepared the question. I'll just ask. There is a question? Ita, please.
Yeah, we had before the colleagues from Spain and also from Chile, the lecture. We had this connection between publications and architecture. Do you see any specific reference to Mendelssohn in Italy because of Bruno Zevi in architectural objects and in architectural planning?
This is a very good question, but it was really not my focus.
Okay.
I'm working on the publication on writings, but it's a fantastic question that I guess we have someone here.
Yeah, so it's also a question to the audience. I know that I was very astonished to hear from Bruno Reichlin once that the Tessin school in Switzerland was very much influenced or referred to Mendelsohn because of the many Italian or the many publications in Italian, which were, of course, important for the Tessin school of architecture. I mean, the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. So there was obviously a very strong influence through Zevi and all the other Italian-speaking authors and publications. So I asked myself, I never researched this, but maybe Maristella can say it because it was very interesting before that we saw this direct connection between publications and reference in architecture, in buildings. And yeah.
Just a comment, because the relation with the first relation of Zevi with Mendelsohn was through Persico, and that's why in the United States, in his exile, he went to look for Wright and Zevi and Mendelsohn. But for sure, Persico, as editor of Casabella, published in Casabella. But I cannot say I didn't look for Mendelsohn in this. I look in the 50s.
Another short question.
No, just a short remark. So this publication that may have referred to Reichlin, this was the Wittig biography that was translated into Italian before the work of Zevi was published eventually, because the publication by Zevi is a thing that's started very early, because actually the book of Zevi is just the recollection of all the little text he published in Architettura Cronaca Storia when publishing I guess it was 10 or 15 drawings each week for a couple of years. And only later he recollected everything and published the book. In the meantime, it was translated into Italian, the Wittig biography of Mendelsohn. An important influence in Italy, and also, I guess, also in the Tessin, was Gillo Dorfles, because Dorfles taught at that time at the Politecnico in Milan, and there was a stronger connection with the Tessin. And Dorfles, who was, he died just last year, and he was so like Methuselah, so 103 years old, and he was born in my home birth city, so Trieste, when Trieste was still under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was the only one. So he was mostly a philosopher of art, but he has a strong interest in architecture, and he was the only critic, the Italian critic, who really knows German. And his book, Barocco nell'architettura moderna, is strongly influenced by Gustav Adolf Platz, the Balkans, the Neuesten Zeit. So the book of Platz nowadays, only the experts know him, but it was the first actual recount of modern architecture, also before Gideon. because it was published in 1927 for the Gobilien Kunstgeschichte. So, das war eine große, so wie eine Art official encyclopedia in Germany. And it was the first recollection of the new modern movement, but he didn't really use this kind of terms. So, and actually, it was a more equilibrated vision of the new architecture.
Sir, can I ask, because we have more remarks, and
yeah, of course.
Actually, this podium is for questions to the speaker, and I think it's good that there is kind of a dialogue between. Then we have another very short remark, I hope, from Mr. Curtis. Maybe. Can we postpone it to Mr. Curtis?
Okay. Hello?
I don't know. Okay.
May I speak or not? Sir?
You can speak, yes.
Thank you very much. About Zevi. Zevi, in his mythology of architecture, made huge leaps between Borromini as a figure in terms of incredible inventiveness, Mendelsohn and Wright. And if there was an inheritance for him, it was actually Getty. I remember being in an intense conversation with him in Via Nomentana 32 years ago, at the time of the judgments of the Wolf Prize, and he insisted on Getty at this point. And he talked at length about the way that Getty and the generation which broke with modern academicism, which in his case was neo-rationalism, which to him was another cancer of architecture, academic, obsessed with the past. So as far as he was concerned, the lineage was in a sense carried on by the generation of the deconstructivists, and very particularly the inventiveness, Jewishness, as he called it, and formal inventiveness and spatial inventiveness of Frank Gehry. So he thought of Gehry as, in a way, the grandchild of Erich Mendelsohn, if you can imagine that.
Anat, thank you, and we will move for the next speakers, which will be online. They're supposed to be online, yes? These are the Americans, so they speak from America. So we have our next two speakers, or the authors of the next lecture, which is named Bay Region Modern Meets Mendelsohn. Is given by Wim de Wit and by Daniel Gregory. So I'll introduce Wim first. Wim is a freelance architectural historian and curator. He studied architecture history in the Catholic University of Nijmegen, the Netherlands. After his graduation, he appointed a scholarly researcher in the Netherlands Documentation Center for Architecture in Amsterdam. He moved to the States in 1982 and worked as a curator in the Cooper Heyot Museum in New York, and for 10 years, from 1983 to 1993, he was a curator for architecture at the Chicago Historical Society. From 1993 to 2013, for 20 years, he was the head of the Spatial Collection and later the Department of Architecture and Contemporary Art at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, which we have people coming from there now. Between 2013 and 2017, he was in a position of adjacent curator of architecture and design in Stanford Cantor Art Center, and he organized exhibitions, published catalogs for those institutions. He was the president of the board of International Confederation of Architectural Museums, And he was a member of the board of the Society of Architectural Historians during the years 1988 and 1991, and later until 2012. This is Wim, and Daniel Gregory is an architectural historian and a longtime magazine and website editor. He is the author of The Cliff May and the Modern Ranch House, The New Farm, Contemporary Rural Architecture, published by the Princeton Architectural Press, and numerous other essays about California architecture. He's a graduate of Yale and got his PhD in architecture from the UC Berkeley, and he lives in, surprisingly, the Bay Area. Wim, please, yes. 20 minutes.
Okay, I will. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, the people can see your presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eran, for this nice introduction. Sorry that I cannot be with you this afternoon, but I am at least at the same continent as you are, and can therefore just be speaking in the same time as you see it. Daniel is still in San Francisco. He's probably fast asleep. He would have had to wake up at a very early moment to be present at the same time. So I am speaking on behalf of both of us. Daniel wrote the part about the Bay Area modernists. I wrote the part about Erich Mendelsohn. So here we go. Of Erich Mendelsohn's late oeuvre, that is the American work designed and executed between 1945 and 1953, his buildings in San Francisco's Bay Area are the least well known. This is somewhat surprising, as Mendelsohn had moved away from the austere, square architecture with its skin of heavy stone and meticulously cut, deep-set windows that he had used in Palestine, and returned to his better-known, lighter, European modernist architecture of Germany and England. One could say that in 1945 he picked up where he had left off in the De La Warr Pavilion in Bexhill-on-Sea of 1934 to 35, for example, where he had given his building an expressive vitality through curved balconies, bay windows, and tubular steel railings. It's even more surprising when the station that the German-American architect had found in Northern California not only several supportive clients who gave him interesting commissions, but also a sympathetic design environment in and outside UC Berkeley's architecture school, which allowed him to thrive one more time in a completely new milieu, a country with new laws and new environmental considerations. This presentation will focus on Mendelsohn's work in the Bay Area and on his interactions with his colleagues in this region. Mendelsohn was probably before the Second World War already known to those architects of Northern California who were interested in European modernism. But they really got to know him during the war when, in the course of the month of April 1942, at the invitation of the School of Architecture and Berkeley's University Administration, he gave a series of lectures entitled Architecture in a World Crisis, Architecture Today, and Architecture in a Rebuilt World. Published in 1944 by the University of California Press as 3 lectures on architecture, these presentations gave the architect the opportunity to advance the idea that in the midst of all confusion on social, economic, and political levels after the First World War, architects had finally discarded the rational and analytical approach to modern architecture and had embraced a new, creative order applying the fundamental laws of nature as a basis for architecture as art. He rejected the rational geometric method of the functionalist machine-inspired design and advocated for an architecture that combined intellect and imagination in all fields of architectural and urban design. I do not know how the Berkeley faculty and students responded to the 3 lengthy lectures, and I did look in the local newspapers and in Berkeley student papers, but have not found any review of it yet. But anyway, this presentation, these lectures must have been positive, the response to it must have been positive, as 3 years later, when Mendelsohn and his wife Louise moved permanently to San Francisco, He was very soon offered a teaching position in the School of Architecture, as we will see below. While the 1942 lectures clearly functioned as a formal introduction of Mendelsohn's thinking to the larger community of architects and interested laypeople in Northern California, a lecture given again at Berkeley 11 years later in 1953 could be seen as his architectural testament, a summary of his architectural philosophy. This lecture, given at the most 7 months before he died in August 1953, may very well have been the last lecture he ever gave. And it is the same text that the previous speaker referred to that was published in 1953 in Architectural Forum. It was a response to Berkeley's Charles M. and Martha Hitchcock lectures given in 1952 by Joseph Hutnut, and you see him here on the screen, the Dean of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Well known for having brought Gropius and Breuer to Harvard during the 1930s, Hutnut was definitely in the camp of the rationalist architects for whom Mendelsohn felt so much contempt. And a large part of his lecture was indeed directed against Hutnut, whom he never mentioned by name, but called instead, quote, a most erudite scholar, end quote, and the honorable man from Boston, end quote. Mendelsohn also called the Hitchcock lecturer a converted contemporary who did not have real principles in architecture. He only had intellect, that is, intellect without imagination. He claimed that architects should have a vision based on what lives in the minds of the people in their community, and then added a somewhat mystic-sounding sentence that, quote, the man of original vision knows that the crest and valley of the wave is the life force of the pounding sea. End quote. I thought about that sentence a lot and listened to it over and over again on the tape recording. But what he meant to say is that expressing the inner life of a community in a building results in an effect similar to that of the waves in the ocean. In other words, just as the rolling waves are the life force of the sea, so the curves in Mendelssohn's architecture represent the life force of the buildings and therefore of the community. It is at this point that the German-American architect introduced the concept of elasticity in architecture, a structural innovation that, according to Mendelsohn, had become possible thanks to a better understanding of the true nature and strength of concrete and steel, which in turn enabled builders to reduce the use of these materials to a minimum in mass and volume. He even put forward the concept of elastic continuity, and we also heard about that in the previous talk, implying that what he had envisioned in the early 1920s in what were then seen as purely imaginary drawings was 30 years later picked up by architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright in his Johnson Wax headquarters in Racine, Wisconsin, or Felix Candela in the Pavilion of Cosmic Rays at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City. Without saying as much, Mendelssohn presented himself as the father of a new movement, a movement that put imagination over matter and that built upon ideas and visions, if not articulated, in his own early sketches. It's in between these two lectures, that is between 1942 when he gave the series of 3 lectures and 1953 when he gave the one that I just mentioned, that Erich Mendelsohn established himself in San Francisco and interacted with the architectural community of the Bay Area. According to Bruno Zevi in his book, Erich Mendelsohn, The Complete Works, Mendelsohn designed a total of at least 10 buildings for San Francisco, but only 4 of them were executed. In 2 of these 4 structures, he definitely was able to realize his architectural vision as expressed in his Berkeley lectures. They both abound with energy. His first building in the city of San Francisco was the Maimonides Hospital for chronically ill patients from 1945 to 50, which you see here in photos of what it looks like at this moment. It's located in the Lower Pacific Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. Built on the narrow lot, the hospital seems to be squeezed in between its 2 side walls that, except for a central slit of windows on the west wall, are completely blank. The result is that all attention is directed towards the front facade, which, while appearing compressed, also reads, or I should say read, as extremely lively. I'm using the past tense read because my observation is a little bit harder to detect these days. 2 years after completion of the hospital, a major change by a different architect, so Mendelsohn was not allowed to be involved at all, was implemented in the facade that completely changed the building's character. The glass fronts of the hospital rooms facing the balconies were pushed forward almost to the railing, as you can see, especially in the left image, to enlarge the rooms inside and thus create space for 60 more beds overall. The glass was then replaced by stuccoed walls with much smaller windows, ruining all effects of light and shadow and depth. Thankfully, there are sketches and photographs, and here you see 2 photographs of the building taken soon after completion. And these photos that show the importance of the deep balconies and especially of the curves in the railings, which on a functional level create more space on the balconies at these spots. And you see that here in the right side image. These spots, or those spots where the building's columns protrude from the facade. So it gives them more space to walk around to those columns. But the curves also have a higher design value. They create a rhythm on the facade of contraction and expansion, as if to give expression to the heartbeat of the building. They are the elements that bring the building to life. This particular sketch, with its sharp outlines and intense shadows, conveys this attention, in my opinion, extremely well. And I hope you will especially look at the thinner sketch in the top right, because there, it's not immediately, but when you focus on it, you can see that there he shows how there has to be a shadow, and especially a shadow on the column, and that the floor goes around those columns, creating that curving of the wall. Mendelsohn's widely published drawings had a huge impact on the architects of Northern California, especially on those who were with him on the faculty of Berkeley School of Architecture. And he was teaching him a class in the old school building before the 1950s, 60s building was built, as you will see later. Architect Joseph Esherick was one of his young colleagues. He was the University of Pennsylvania architecture graduate whose early California work was contemporary but regional in its response to urban and rural settings. His early houses, like one for the winemaking Gallo family in the state's Central Valley of 1946, found inspiration in the area's agricultural vernacular while maximizing daylight and outdoor connections. His firm would go on to design the concrete and glass Monterey Bay Aquarium of 1984, which takes the simple gabled roof forms of cannery architecture from the early 20th century, for which the area in Northern California had become famous, and reworks it into a grand new marine life viewing machine. Gables extend, open up, and carve away as wings and terraces thrust over and into the rocky shoreline. Looking back later in life, Esherick noted that Mendelsohn's teaching seemed an extension of his sketching technique, as if he was trying to, quote, get the students to put off any kind of commitment. Everything was looked at from the outside, end quote, as indeed Mendelsohn himself did in all his sketches, looking at a building from below with a curved line indicating the sky. Chuck Davis, a Mendelsohn student who would become one of Joseph Esherick's partners and be very involved in the design of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, voiced the general reaction Mendelsohn was, quote, a very exciting person to, simply because he understood modernism as it was formed in Germany, end quote. Mendelsohn's new California compatriots also included 2 leading Bay Region modern designers that in their prime, namely architect William Wooster and landscape architect Thomas Church, whom you both see here in this very funny juxtaposition. The architect looking dreamy with his pencil in his hand, and the landscape architect very strong with his shears over his shoulder. Thomas Church is the landscape architect who designed the gardens at both Mendelsohn's Wesselhouten, which we will see in a second, and the Maimonides Hospital. Worcester's practice as architect and educator extended from the late 1920s through the 1960s. His most famous early residential work includes the Gregory farmhouse of 1927 in the Santa Cruz Mountains, south of San Francisco, where white unornamented vertical board walls, a stockade-like wall and entry gate, and a sheer whitewater tower and lookout with a fresh face on Westlake Ranch Farms. We call it Texan Pope House number 2 of 1939 in Orinda, a few miles east of Berkeley, is one of Worcester's most abstract and geometric designs. This one. The house wraps around the central courtyard where the roof opens up to trace a giant circle of sunlight. These designs won design awards and found wide publication in architectural journals and shelter magazines. The work combined simple materials, usually redwood boards or shingles, plywood, concrete block, even adobe, with elegant proportions, extensive porches, and abundant natural light to make designs that celebrated California living. They were often both modest and memorable, but confusing to some viewers who could not get past the plainness and the plywood. Frank Lloyd Wright even described Worcester, as he was so good at doing, as that shack architect. And for those of you who do not know the word shack, it is really like a wooden hut. The Bay Region's version of a contemporary functionalist approach. Quote, I like to work on direct, honest solutions, avoiding exotic materials, using indigenous things so that there's no affectation and the best is obtained for the money, end quote. It was a modernism derived from simplicity. During much of the 1940s, as Mendelsohn began looking toward a move to California, Worcester ran the architecture school at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he got to know other stars of European modernism, including Bauhaus emigres and Mendelssohn competitors, Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer. Worcester also knew Alvar Aalto and even arranged for him to design the big outdoor in 1949. Worcester returned to Berkeley to become Dean of Architecture in 1950. In that position of Dean, Worcester considered Mendelsohn an important member of the Berkeley design community, and the respect was mutual. For in 1944, Mendelsohn joined Gropius in writing letters, nominating Worcester as a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. And you see that letter here on the screen. Architect Vernon de Mars was another young teacher at Berkeley during the early 1950s. He was part of the team that designed the university's Sproul Plaza, the plaza that was known because of the 1960s free speech movement, and the Brutalist concrete Bauer Worcester Hall, which you see here on the screen, housing the new College of Environmental Design, as the school was called after Worcester took over. The Mars.
I want to remind you another 2 minutes, please.
Okay, that's fine. A variety of architectural points of view and said, even though he wouldn't do the Mendelsohn type of thing himself, he admired the man for his accomplishment. And as Mendelsohn wrote in a letter to his wife Louise in 1950, quote, Bill Worcester, most friendly and understanding, cannot raise my salary because of budget. However, he will see Sproul, who was the president, and see to it that I get a commission for a campus building. He implored me to stay on, as he said, the school cannot go on without me, end quote. That promised project turned out to be the Atomic Energy Committee Research Building of 1952, now known as Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. It's located on the crest of the hill behind the university proper, for which he drew several evocative massing studies. It was completed after his death, and Mendelssohn's death, and it's the least well-known of Mendelssohn's oeuvre because of the highly classified nature of the research inside the building. And I'm just going to show you a few of Thomas Church's gardens, and these two, which are called the Kirkham Garden and the Martin Beach Garden. The last one is in Athens. And then there's the famous Dewey and Jean Donnell Garden in Sonoma. Mendelsohn must have felt an affinity with the Bay Area's architectural community. While his preferred building materials, concrete, glass, and steel, are very different from those used by the Bay region modernists, he was just as attentive to the siting of his buildings and to the relationship between inside and out. He, however, took his work one step further. As discussed earlier in the lecture, through the use of curving or protruding spaces and windows, he created a sense in his buildings that they were living organisms, structures that had naturally grown with pulsating veins or contracting muscles moving right under the skin. His design philosophy can probably best be illustrated in the Russell residence, 1950 to 51, a house in San Francisco Pacific Heights neighborhood for a descendant of the well-known San Francisco Haas family. With one wing of the L-shaped house lifted off the ground and featuring a large circular volume projecting from the corner of the master bedroom, as you can see in the left slide, the house gives the inhabitants the feeling that they are floating above the San Francisco Bay, as if they are part of the natural environment. A few blocks away, also in 1951, Joseph Esrick, whom I saw earlier. Yeah, I've almost done.
A gentle reminder.
Yeah. So for the cousin of the Madeline Haas, Russell, he designed the Rhoda Haas Goldman house, which is designed by Esrick, and Rhoda Haas was a descendant of the Levi Strauss Blue Jean Company owners. So I want to skip then to the last part. Before concluding this presentation, I would like to quickly draw your attention to the fourth and last of Mendelssohn's Bay Area buildings. It's the Varian Associates Laboratories in Palo Alto, designed for the Varian brothers, inventors of the Klystron tube, an instrument designed to amplify radio waves into microwaves, which could generate the power for particle accelerators. The laboratories building is a simple multi-winged open hall was the first structure in the Stanford Research Park, and thus stands right away at the beginning of the development of Silicon Valley and the history of the computer. Like the AEC research laboratories at Berkeley, the Varian laboratories were completed after Mendelssohn's death and show many details that were most probably not designed by the original architect at all, but were creations by the man who continued to work on this job, Michael Gallus. Mendelssohn's last two buildings, because of the self-effacing appearance of the realized structures, seem to suggest a tragic ending to a great career. However, both stood at the beginning of histories that, for better or worse, determined the history of the second half of the 20th century. Nuclear energy in Berkeley and the computer at Stanford. And that, I think, is a huge achievement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wim. We have passed this successfully, though the transatlantic connection was sometimes, but mostly we heard you very well. And
you could see me.
I open the floor for one remark from Maristella.
Wim, thank you very much for highlighting the context of Erich Mendelsohn in the Bay Area. But under this perspective and looking at the World Heritage List nomination and so on, how do you feel that we could frame his practice at the time, in San Francisco, within the universal value?
I think what is important of this work of the post-Second World War period is this idea about intellect and spirit and imagination, and that combination into a new architecture. I think that that's one of those concepts that is so extremely important. And it actually goes back to 1917-18 and the Expressionist period. So I think that could be one of those streams that could be highlighted through a number of projects. If in the end you would want to choose the San Francisco projects or not, And if they would be available to be included, that's of course a totally different question. But I think that would be the second question. First of all, I think do look at this idea and this concept of intellect and imagination.
I think Wim stressed again the case when we talked about the influence of Erich Mendelsohn in later generations and other places in the former session. So this also your lecture has highlighted this again regarding the influence he had, and also through his students probably and his colleagues in their work. Okay, we will go for the next lecture, and then we'll have a common discussion with all the participants. So, our next speaker is Emily Pugh. Ah, well done. Emily is an art historian. She received her PhD in art history from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and currently serves as a head of the Getty Research Institute Digital Art History Department. So it's a really GRI session also. Her research focuses on post-war architecture in the US and in Germany, as well as technologies of architectural representation. Her first book, Architecture, Politics and Identity in Divided Berlin, was published in 2014 from the University of Pittsburgh Press. She's currently at work on a second book titled The Modernist Mystique, focused on the architectural criticism on US television in the 50s and 60s. Please, Emily.
Thank you. I want to echo everyone's thanks to the organizers of this event. And thank you also for your invitation to present. I've had a wonderful time. I've learned a lot. So we're going back to influence and historiography. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the extensive and far-reaching influence of Erich Mendelsohn was in evidence in many parts of the world. It was apparent, for example, in the circular garage at the corner of Hermann Wunderlich's Kaufhof department store building in Cologne. And evident also in Frei Otto's novel design for the German pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal. One could detect Mendelssohn's influence also in the Opera House slowly taking shape in Sydney, and in TWA's Jet Age Terminal at Idlewild Airport in New York. Yet despite the fact that Mendelssohn's aesthetic and overall approach clearly had a global impact on post-World War II architecture, critical appraisal of Mendelssohn's career was at a relative low point in these same decades. It is a considerable irony, for example, that in 1960, at the very moment Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal was rising in New York, Mendelssohn's Schocken department store in Stuttgart was demolished. What explains this incongruity between Mendelssohn's influence and his reception? Well, there is no one factor that alone explains it. It is my contention that the perception of Mendelssohn as an expressionist architect, first and foremost, played a significant role in his marginalization within architectural histories of modernism written in the US and Western Europe, particularly from the late 1950s. The case of his reception in the US is of particular interest as an important origin point for the idea of Mendelssohn as an expressionist architect, and because of the significant role his ideas played in shaping the American built environment from the 1930s onward. Appreciation for Mendelssohn's work in the US rose quickly and steadily, following what Pencil Point's journal called his introduction to the American architectural public via the 1929 Contemporary exhibit in New York. He was quickly recognized as one of the most important figures in the burgeoning modern architectural movement, the subject of glowing articles in major architectural journals. In an article from 1930 titled Creative Architecture of Erich Mendelsohn, for example, author Paul Lester Wiener wrote, quote, "His inventions and innovations are inspired by a great revolutionary force, by vision, intuition, and structural logic. His work seems to point the way which architectural development will pursue in the future. We are face to face with a new conception, a new philosophy of the feeling for space, that sublimated sense that all great architects possess." Many of the critical appraisals of Mendelssohn's architecture from the 1930s through the 50s in the US focused in particular on his use of modern materials, cutting-edge construction techniques, and novel aesthetics. Quote, "His break with the past is definite and clear," wrote Wiener in Architectural Forum. "His creations determine their own forms out of the nature of modern building materials, out of function, use, and expediency." Similarly, the press release for the 1942 retrospective of Mendelssohn at New York's MoMA notes his, quote, "great interest in concrete and steel construction and his sense of monumentality." When Expressionism is mentioned in such critiques, it is usually cited only as an early influence on Mendelssohn, one aspect of a multifaceted career. In the same MoMA press release, his sketches are described as, quote, "an important document of the Expressionist movement in architecture." But it notes, the sculptural streamlined curves of the Einstein Tower and the early drawings give way in his mature work to a style more essentially architectural in character. Likewise, in books on Mendelssohn authored by British historian Arnold Wittig and by German historian Wolf von Eckardt, published in the US in 1956 and 1960 respectively, Expressionism is mentioned only as a first, if important, phase of a long career. Von Eckardt mentions the word only once. He cites Mendelssohn's 1921 trip to the Netherlands as a greater influence. Wittig insists that Mendelssohn, quote, "came too late, really, to be part of the German Expressionist movement." Overall, assessments of Mendelssohn in the US before the late 1950s regard him not as an expressionist specifically or exclusively, but as a quintessentially modern architect. In, for example, a piece on Mendelssohn published in Architectural Forum in 1955, following his death, the journal declared that he had, quote, "influenced the course of 20th century architecture more than most of his colleagues," describing him as a man who, quote, "lived and died an explorer of modern architecture." Far from reading his work as a reflection of any single style or movement, the journal characterizes Mendel's work as vital and ever evolving. Quote, "He went through artistic periods as defined as Picasso's. In the 50s in America, he was still developing. He scorned to be content with the blankly efficient techniques of the industrial modern style he had helped develop in the 20s. He wanted lyrical grace." As one might expect, Mendelssohn's presence in American architectural discourse faded markedly after his death in 1953. It is really from this point, that is about the late 1950s, that the arc of Mendelssohn's reception in the US began to shift and to bend along the same fraught course as that of architectural expressionism. Of course, to understand the receptionism of expressionism in the US in the 1950s, one has to go back to the 1930s and the influential Modern Architecture International Exhibition held at New York's MoMA in 1932. The exhibition's curators, Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, famously disparaged expressionist designs, dismissing them as overwrought and utopian, mere, quote, "extravagant fantasies." Expressionist architects, argued Johnson in the exhibition catalog, quote, "indulged in arbitrary curves, zigzags, and fantastic decoration, breaking down all formal discipline, traditional or structural." This view of expressionism was echoed also by critic and historian Siegfried Gideon, who in his Space, Time, and Architecture, originally published in the US in 1941, dismissed the movement as, quote, "Faustian outbursts against an inimical world." before concluding that, quote, the expressionist influence could not be a healthy one or perform any service for architecture. The image that resulted from such critiques was that of an architecture visionary, irrational, and impractical, presented as the opposite of what was called rationalist or functionalist architecture, which was linked with qualities like the embrace of innovative construction technology and architects like Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Neither Hitchcock, Johnson, nor Gideon were the first to repudiate Expressionism, nor were they the only ones to do so. As historian Rosemarie Haig-Blutter has argued, many figures closely allied with the movement attempted from the 1930s to distance themselves from Expressionism, or even to, quote, cover up the fact that they had been involved with a subsequently unfashionable movement. What is noteworthy about these American accounts is first that they labeled Mendelsohn specifically as an expressionist. In the MoMA exhibition catalog, for example, Johnson claimed that the indulgences of Expressionism were, quote, best exemplified in the work of Hans Polzig, Otto Bartning, and Erich Mendelsohn, executed between the end of the war and 1924. In Space-Time and Architecture as well, Gideon makes this link, albeit implicitly, with his derisive mention in relation to Expressionism of, quote, concrete towers as flaccid as jellyfish, a clear reference to the Einstein Tower. The fact that, aside from the descriptions of Mendelsohn as an expressionist, these accounts largely ignored the architect's work, only served to foreground the association. These critiques by incredible influence. These interpretations cast long shadows into the post-war and across the reception of architectural expressionism and of modernism more generally in the US. Their biases help to explain why the expressionist movement and architects associated with it received comparatively scant attention from historians and critics over the course of the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 1960s. Indeed, expressionist architecture was not merely ignored by critics in the US and elsewhere, but maligned. By 1967, Rainer Banham would write in the New York Review of Books that Expressionism had, quote, come to rank as a sinister aberration that had to be trampled down whenever it reappeared. Yet there was, at this exact moment, a push to reassess Expressionism and reassert it into the history of modern architecture. Banham's declaration, for example, appeared in his review of the first post-war book on the topic, British historian Dennis Sharp's Modern Architecture and Expressionism of 1966. Banham himself had, of course, included Expressionism in his 1960 overview of modernism titled Theory and Design in the First Machine Age. These and other histories did not necessarily represent a reappraisal of critical positions of figures like Hitchcock and Johnson, however. Instead, these histories largely affirmed interpretations of Expressionism as irrational and unbuildable. Moreover, histories like Sharp's presented the movement as a short-lived side branch from the main trunk of modernism, a, quote, romantic trend that had failed to develop. As Blutter would later write of this 1960s revival, quote, as soon as Expressionism was raised from oblivion, it was consigned to a new grave. It is in the context of this revival of Expressionism that Mendelsohn comes to be labeled by critics and historians as an expressionist architect. By the mid-1960s, coverage of his oeuvre had become largely confined to the first phase of his career, on his early sketches and above all on the Einstein Tower. In focusing so narrowly on this early work, these critiques created the impression, or even stated explicitly, that this period marked the height of his career, when he created his most important work. This idea was reinforced when, although figures like Banham or Sharp note that Mendelsohn moved on from or quote-unquote abandoned Expressionism, they do not discuss examples from the rest of his career in any detail. Some critiques take this further and argue that, like Expressionism itself, Mendelsohn did not develop as an architect beyond the 1910s and 20s. In a 1969 review of his early drawings, for example, New York Times critic Ada Louise Huxtable commented that Mendelssohn, quote, settled on his style in 1914. From this point as well, when work from any period of Mendelssohn's career was discussed, it was often read through the lens of Expressionism. Consider a small news item from a 1962 issue of Architectural Forum, in which the author described Mendelssohn's Schocken department store building, excuse the typo, using the expressionist-laden terms romantic and early modern. Such critiques acknowledged the architect's influence and importance. However, they implicitly located his impact in the distant past. This discourse had a cumulative effect, gradually pushing Mendelssohn into the background of architectural history. By 1988, New York Times architecture critic Paul Goldberger would describe Mendelssohn as, quote, one of those architects whose name everyone knows, but about whom no one ever seems to know very much. History has relegated him to what can best be thought of as a supporting role in the great drama of 20th century modernism. Certainly, Expressionism was an important and lasting influence on modernism. However, one can say the very same thing about Walter Gropius or Mies van der Rohe, both of whom were also deeply influenced by Expressionist ideas, not only in the 1910s and 20s, but throughout their careers. This fact begs the question, why did critics writing in the 1950s and 60s largely ignore the Expressionist tendencies in the work of Gropius and Mies? Yet, when it came to Mendelssohn, these tendencies were all they could see. Among other factors, I would argue that the example of Mendelssohn's post-war reception illustrates the limitations of an American architectural discourse that understood modernism in terms of either expressionism or functionalism. Architects, that is, were defined as belonging to one of these two categories, which were furthermore understood as discrete and mutually exclusive. As a result, the complex relationship between these two tendencies was obscured. This binary conceptualization is particularly insufficient one for understanding the work of Mendelssohn, an architect who, as many critics noted, did not fit neatly into either category. In Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, for example, Banham acknowledges that Mendelssohn, quote, never described himself by the epithet most commonly coupled with his name and work, expressionist. At the 1962 Modern Architecture Symposium at Columbia University, a convening of the leaders of the American architectural establishment organized to, quote, to discuss, quote, the origin and applicability of the terms functionalism and expressionism, the group had difficulty placing Mendelssohn within this framework. Some of those pointed out that he never identified with either label, while historian George R. Collins remarked that he, quote, seemed to be straddling both. The difficulty of locating Mendelssohn within the dominant narratives of architectural modernism continues to dog historians. In his 2017 survey text, A New History of Modern Architecture, for example, author Colin Davies writes that, quote, historians often include the German architect Erich Mendelsohn in the category expressionist for the negative reason that he does not easily fit anywhere else. The continuing influence of this binary division of modernism is a key reason why Mendelssohn's role in shaping modern architecture remains underappreciated. There is an important study to be written, for example, on the nature and extent of Mendelssohn's influence on the evolution of the American built environment from the late 1930s. Certainly, he had a profound impact on the designer Norman Bell Geddes, who developed his signature streamlined aesthetic after encountering the work of Mendelssohn, whom he met in 1924. Through works like the General Motors Pavilion at the 1939 New York World's Fair, Bell Geddes shaped American architecture and design for decades. Bell Geddes, in turn, influenced on the General Motors Pavilion project. It is Saarinen who, perhaps more than any other American architect, seems to be a standard-bearer of Mendelssohn's work in the US, although the relationship between the two has perhaps not yet fully been explored. In fact, critics often took pains to distance Saarinen's work from that of Mendelssohn. In his 1962 book on Saarinen, for example, author Alan Temko makes a point of linking him with the functionalist camp of modernism, writing, quote, "A superficial formal comparison of Mendelssohn's sensuous vaults and pylons with Saarinen's can be misleading. Instead, he argues, the real antecedent for Saarinen's expressionism is found at the furthest opposite extreme of the modernist movement." And then he mentions Le Corbusier. The examples of Getty's and Saarinen demonstrate another reason, besides the label of expressionist, that Mendelssohn's critics have too often relegated him to a secondary role within the history of modernism. The extent of his influence has itself been cited as an explanation for the lack of regard his work received in the US. As Louis Mendelssohn wrote in The New Yorker in 1942, quote, "Mendelssohn's fame as an architect has been somewhat obscured by his success." Okay. Critics have tended to assume that anyone who has made headway as easily as Mendelssohn among industrialists and other wealthy clients must be a trifle impure in his aesthetics. This notion persisted into the post-war period. In 1969, Ada Louise Huxtable similarly noted that, quote, "It has been fashionable to look down on Mendelssohn's obvious style and too easy and early success." And in the same article, she talks about modernistic cliches like ribbon windows. It's interesting to note. Whether marginalized because of his association with Expressionism or the fact that his style was widely imitated, a full assessment of Mendelssohn's entire career and his far-reaching influence seems long overdue. Likewise, a more nuanced and thorough analysis of Expressionism, particularly in relation to so-called functionalism, would seem a necessary step in developing histories of modern architecture that can probably accommodate the full scope of Mendelssohn's career. Perhaps what is needed is to revive the kind of incisive critiques that his work received in the US in the 1930s and 40s that could account both for Mendelssohn's creative imagination and his mastery of construction. Such an approach is exemplified by, for example, Louis Mumford, who wrote in 1942, "Mendelssohn's positive talent ranks high. He has assimilated the innovations and avoided the extravagances of his contemporaries. What is even more important, he has exercised his own fantasy with restraint, with self-discipline, with respect for the conditions of construction and the needs and purposes of his clients." Thank you.
Perfect, Emily. You have another half a minute, so.
Nice.
I think we can, Anat, if you will join. We have 10 minutes to conclude this session together with Wim. We have already a question in the back. Just please tell your name and...
Andreas Putz again. Listening to the last two talks, I wonder if there's something implicit in the two talks, or something you did not mention, but you somehow implied, is that there is some prejudice in this East Coast American discourse on architectural history, which Mendelssohn seems not to fit in because it was dominated by Gropius and Mies and followers. And whereas Mendelssohn is a West Coast architect after 1945. So it's something you did not mention, but I think implied in your talk, that there's some internal American problem with recognizing a West Coast architecture for some time. And that's why maybe Mendelssohn did not fit in the grid for some reason.
Well, perhaps I'll say something and then maybe you want to add. I hadn't thought about that actually, but I think there might be something to that. Certainly at this time of the post-war, there definitely was this divide between the East and West and this kind of lack of regard on the East Coast for things going on in the West. But I do also want to emphasize that he was quite well known and quite popular seemingly all over the U.S. in the 40s and 50s. So I think it's really only later that he. And I'm maybe onto something there.
May I add something to that?
Oh, I think you're muted. Are you muted?
No, I'm not. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. What I wanted to add to it, that actually Mendelsohn and especially Louise felt that his reception on the East Coast when he first arrived in New York was much better. He got much more respect and was really received as a really well-known architect, much more than in Northern California, where he felt that even though there were these colleagues with whom he worked, he did not really get the respect and the not paying homage to him as what he had hoped and what he got on the East Coast. So I'm not sure actually that there is this feeling that the competition between East and West was in that way. You didn't hear me? Hello?
We have an online question. So maybe
Okay.
Question, comment? First Kathleen and then...
Hello. Thank you both. Thank you, everybody, for those three papers. I want to say that I think there's a lot to the East versus West Coast divide. I've written about the division between Worcester and Mumford on the one hand, and the post-war East Coast on the other. It was a pretty big firefight, and Mendelsohn was on the wrong side of it, despite the very warm welcome he'd received on the East Coast previously. I taught at Berkeley for a number of years, and I had some very nice conversations with Joe Escherich about Mendelsohn. I think that Mendelsohn had an impact in the 40s and early 50s in California, but not an enormous one. Saarinen, on the other hand, I think is really interesting because he clearly knew Mendelssohn's work very well from even before the time he started studying architecture. Remember that his father had known Mendelssohn already in the 1940s, in the 1920s. One of the people Mendelssohn goes to visit in 1924 is Eliel Saarinen. Eliel Saarinen, Albert Kahn ranked just behind Frank Lloyd Wright as the reason to make the trip. And I think that in particular, Aline Saarinen, Saarinen's second wife, is very, very savvy about communications and media and wants to make sure that Eero Saarinen is understood as not being in relationship to his father, whose work she does a great deal to undervalue in ways that are still unfortunately influential, and not being reliant on Mendelssohn. But clearly, there are drawings from early in Saarinen's career that show an extremely strong relationship to what Mendelssohn has built in the 20s, and it keeps going. I think the need to reinvent Saarinen as something that's fresh and new, and thus discount the ways in which he's looked at modernism's past, and even to admit that modernism is by this point partly historical, is one of the things that's at work here. But I want to thank all three of you for these very good papers, or all four of you.
So just to continue, did Eero Saarinen mention Mendelssohn, from what you know?
I mean, maybe Kathleen knows better than I. Interestingly, I think, and I would agree completely with what she's saying about Aline, because often who he's referencing is Le Corbusier and Mies. So I think he's obviously, or maybe Aline is placing his work within this very particular lineage, which is the lineage of, in Kathleen's formulation, the East Coast of Johnson, of Hitchcock, and not of, the Mumford or Bay modern regional, or the Bay regionalism modern style. So, you know, I'm not a scholar of Eran per se, but it would be interesting. But she's saying clearly in the drawings he's referencing Mendelssohn. I don't know if he's explicitly. It'd be interesting to know if he's reading Mendelssohn, for example.
So we have an online remark. William Curtis.
Okay, so this is Tim speaking. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, it's really rather confusing with this webinar setting. I basically have a footnote for Emily's contribution because you rightly suggested that there is really hardly, actually there is no mention whatsoever in Space-Time and Architecture of any of Erich Mendelsohn's works. Absolutely zero entries and no addition. And Erich Mendelsohn actually sent a copy of Space-Time and Architecture to Albert Einstein. All three men were already in the United States by 1941 because Gideon came in 1939 to deliver the Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard. And Albert Einstein, whose buzzword space-time, this formula, was widely abused or maybe disformed by Gideon, incorporated into his modern historiography. He actually jots down a poem in one of his sketchbooks, which one can find in the archives. I have the German version here, unfortunately not the English translation, but it's very fantastic to read that. It's a rhyme, actually. It's 4 lines by Albert Einstein. So kind of a revenge, I think, that Erich Mendelsohn took about Gideon.
We have more? Alona.
Hi. Anat, I wanted to ask, you talked about the different interpretation of Mendelssohn, and I was wondering if we have any record of what was the influence outside, let's say, of Zevi outside of Italy. Where was he read? When was his literature was in the syllabi of architectural history? Because, for example, when you go to Istanbul, you see so much kind of quote-unquote Mendelssohn architecture. So, because it seems to me that a lot of this kind of reception, it was the misfortune to move into the US, but in other parts of East Europe, Middle East, and so on, he had enormous influence, and the depiction is completely different. So I was wondering if we can trace this kind of influence through the accounts that you discussed.
No, I can go further because I focus on particularly in England and Italy, but hearing now what was Emily talking about United States, I think it's very much in terms of historiography, in terms of position, I think it's not very different from what you show in the journals, in the newspapers, in the critique. I think it's the same. And in fact, there is this connection between Europe and the English scholars that went to America. So for me, what's happening in United, it's very, it connects with what is happening in United States in terms of critique. I can't. Yeah, you were right. You were right, but it's another. But maybe, Emily, you talk about. You talk about Mumford from one side and another critique from another side. Maybe you should look at what's happening in the circle of Mumford, for example. And just to talk about Mumford, just to take this connection, there is this present question about what is essential about these buildings, about Mendelsohn in terms of for ICOMOS and in terms of the mission of the essential mission of this conference, of this meeting. I was thinking that because of this connection of month and we begin to talk about regionalism yesterday, and Curtis also talked about regionalism. I would come back to the definition of regionalism of Mumford, meaning what he worked on South of Architecture, that it is the result of his lectures in 41, that regionalism is the result of the consolidation of layers of culture. And then I think when we think about Mendelssohn, an exilé, it could be understood as an agent of transference. So this is in terms of how you elaborate your report. I think, So I think recover the definition of regionalism of Mendelssohn, that about these layers of different layers of culture to form a culture, a universal culture. I think this is first a national culture, but also a universal culture. So I think this is very important for someone like Mendelssohn, an exile. And then I remember also the sociologist Marcel Mauss that also talk about layers of cultures, and he even talk about agent of transference, and he talk about Jewish as the agent of about the communities, different communities, and then Jewish in the community as agents of transference. So I think there is something here that can be used. And more, to conclude, and more, because Mumford was so tied to the question of Jewish architecture, and we have to remember the article on Jewish modern synagogue architecture of 24, that he has used almost exactly, the same description of the Middle East landscape that Mendelssohn used. So I would go to look for Mumford just to...
Thank you, Anat. I think it's a good point to conclude. I'm the master of the time, so we have to conclude this session. Thank you for talking about the future, though session was looking backwards, but with one eye on the future. Thank you, Wim. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Anat, for participating.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody, for being. There is, first of all, a coffee pause until... what?
I'm sorry, Eran. I have a small organizational comment for you. Because those of you who are leaving today by plane, they should be careful because there's a strike on the BER. So many flights are cancelled. And if somebody of you wants to fly home today, please come to my desk that we can check your flight, okay? Thanks a lot.
Yes, we are in the building of the union, so that's what happens. At 3:30, we have the concluding panel session. Please stay, and because we're working 2 days in order to come to this moment to think together how to proceed, and we need your ideas and ingeniosity. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like to express my thanks to Professor Jörg Haspel, who has invited me to participate in this symposium. I can say that I learned a lot about Erich Mendelsohn, his architecture, his thinking, and also his influence in his time and beyond. And I understand, I take the flyer of our meeting. The aim is, so I quote from the flyer, the aim is to identify the potential outstanding universal value, OUV, of Erich Mendelsohn's work for a UNESCO World Heritage transnational serial nomination. During these 2 days, we heard a lot. I think we got a lot of ideas on which we may base a definition of a description of the OUV of the work of Erich Mendelsohn. I learned also during this meeting that besides inscription of some of his works on the World Heritage List, another ambition of the meeting, born by the initiative Erich Mendelsohn, is also to inscribe part of his archive, of his written inheritance on the World Documentary List of UNESCO. So we have there are two approaches. They are logically, as Professor Haspel yesterday said, they are linked, of course. It's the same architect, but the procedures with UNESCO are separate, are quite different, very different. And I propose that we start with this exercise to get some information about how such an inscription can be launched, initiated, and then we come to the probably more difficult issue of an inscription on the World Heritage List of UNESCO. And so for the first subject, I would like to invite Marleen Meißner. She is a member of the German National Commission of UNESCO, and she's responsible for World Heritage and also for the World Documentary Heritage. And I would like to invite you to present to us or to inform us about how such an endeavor could be started and what the preconditions would be, what we would have to obey.
Of course. Thank you very much, Mr. Worbs. Yes, my name is Marleen Meißner from the German Commission for UNESCO, and I'm not directly responsible for the Memory of the World program, but of course I can provide you with some information on how the whole process is organized. So every 2 years, you may submit proposals for the Memory of the World Register to the International Advisory Committee in Paris. And the last submission was done in November. So the German Expert Committee for Memory of the World already submitted at least German suggestions and applications for this list. And the next possibility would be in autumn 2023. So until then, interested organizations like museums or archives can suggest their applications to the German National Commission. And the National Commission provides advice on whether this application may be successful. And then it is submitted to the National Committee. And the National Committee finally decides whether to submit the application to the advisory committee in Paris. So this is the general process. And we as a German UNESCO Commission always suggest not to nominate whole archives or whole canons of one person,
but instead to nominate one crucial document, something which has a special message, which stands for something, like, for example, the works, specific documents of Martin Luther representing the Reformation in Germany, or now we submitted a proposal for the first terrestrial globe, like something one of a kind, a special document representing something. So not a whole canon or not a whole bibliography of some person, as this would be a case with all of Mendelssohn's works. So here's our proposal to decide for one or a few documents representing his work.
Thank you. Well, there's one. We have already the archive of one architect of the 20th century, Oskar Niemeyer. His archive is on the Memory of the World list,
yes.
But it was done in 2013, was put on the list in 2013. In the meanwhile, we had a reform of the procedures, and
yes, and also
I understand now it's not so easy to put again a whole archive. It was the architectural archive of Oskar Niemeyer with the sketches and so on. Not everything, but still an archive.
Yes, that's true. And theoretically, it's not forbidden to nominate whole archives, but the specialists of the Memory of the World program just recommend not to do this, because the success is chances for success are greater if you just choose one crucial document. And the difference to Oskar Niemeyer is, as I understand the application correctly, his works or his documents were nominated as a whole because there were many works who have not been built. So to save his ideas which have not been realized in practice.
Okay. Thank you. As I understand from the proceedings of yesterday and today, it would be a binational nomination, Germany and the United States. There's no other country involved. I think these are the Getty Foundation and the Kunstbibliothek in Berlin. These are the two places which possess the the archive, of Mendelssohn. We discussed it in the interval before. It needs for the nomination. So theoretically, the nomination for the World Documentary List could be done either by the United States or by Germany, but as the United States are no longer member of UNESCO, it would have to be done by Germany. Germany is and can do it in principle. United States at the moment cannot.
Except for special international organizations can submit it directly, which are United Nations organizations or organizations of the United Nations system and non-governmental organizations. So there is still a possibility, but I think, it might be easier theoretically.
But the Getty Foundation or an association of the, American Archives could not do it. Is that correct?
Well, it depends if the Getty Foundation is an international non-governmental organization. I don't know whether this is the case.
Anyway, it would be tricky, probably. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, any comment from the panelists on this special issue? Yes, please.
I would just like to use the opportunity to ask you directly, because we were discussing about Mendelsohn's work, and we found out that there is a very strong connection between the buildings and the archival material. So you say one document. Well, this is really difficult, and I wonder whether it would be a possibility to nominate, if we have to limit to just one object, if we might find or choose one building with all the process of form finding in the sketches, in, let's say, the whole letters and all of what is connected to this building, in order to make one example of the Mendelssohn cosmos as Mordohovic described it. So this might be an example for the whole oeuvre in the two archives.
Mm-hmm. And just to add, this one document should be of world significance. This is how the Memory of the World program, I think this is comparable to the OUV in the World Heritage program. Mm-hmm. It's, or in the World Heritage Convention, it's the world significance a document must show in order to be nominated as Memory of the World.
It must not be one piece of paper, mm-hmm. but a logical
mm-hmm. A unit.
Unit, yes. Mm. Okay, but I think this is...
I think one thing I could add, such an application for the Memory of the World Register should be accompanied by an independent advisory opinion. So that means you need some expert who is writing, who would submit this independent opinion to UNESCO.
And who could that be in the World Heritage, World Documentary Program?
I don't know, but I think we saw in the last 2 days enough experts who are able to write such an advisory opinion.
But there's no obvious, let's say.
No, but
evaluator like ICOMOS.
Yes, the International Advisory Committee will go through the nomination dossier in the end, but it is always good to have maybe it is normal that such an independent advisory opinion accompanies such an application for the Memory of the World Register. So someone of you should consider to write this.
Okay.
Well, and another one should be able to fill in the format for the application. So you need another one, or maybe 2 or 3 or 4, a writing team for the nomination itself, for the dossier itself.
The hard work is to come.
Yeah.
Yes. But of course, the German Commission for UNESCO will also provide people with advice on how to
have experience this respect. Thank you. Well, I think then we can go to the other ambition of this initiative, of your initiative, namely to nominate the work of, or some examples of the work of Erich Mendelsohn to the World Heritage List, which probably will be the more difficult and more tedious exercise. You have heard Le Corbusier took 10 years to be inscribed and was quite an adventure. And it's not that easy task. I mean, in the beginning, as you may know, in the beginning of the World Heritage Convention, it was much easier than it is nowadays. The convention gives just 3 words as a criteria for the inscription of a site: the overwhelming universal value. Okay, but what is this? There's nothing in the convention about it. And in the first days, in the first years of the convention, when the World Heritage Committee was still a committee of experts, Often they knew each other from other meetings, and one expert said, Taj Mahal. Okay, overwhelming universal value accepted. And another one said, it's a bit anecdotal, Machu Picchu. Yeah, okay. The first sites were inscribed without a lot of bureaucratic procedures. But when the list was growing and the obvious candidates had been inscribed, then it became more and more complicated, and the committee decided about operational guidelines which define the OUV more precisely. Frau Ringbeck was talking about it yesterday, and she also quoted the relevant paragraphs of the operational guidelines, which have to be respected when nominating a serial transbordery nomination. So far. And another issue maybe I would like to state at the beginning here, in this case, the legal background or legal basis, for World Heritage inscription is a convention, the World Heritage Convention of 1972, and all 8 countries which have buildings of Erich Mendelsohn, which they are members of this convention, including US and Israel. So here we don't have this issue of non-membership of UNESCO. This doesn't count in this respect. That's an advantage. But still, the committee is a committee of the World Heritage Committee, which in the end decides about any nomination. Is a political, nowadays it became political committee. The representatives, they are experts, but very often they are also ambassadors representing the countries, and in certain cases political considerations are stronger than, for example, the opinion of ICOMOS International, the advisory body of UNESCO for cultural heritage. Well, this as, let's say, as introduction, and I would like to, what you would have to do if you want to nominate or initiate a nomination. You cannot do it directly because it can be done only through the governments of your countries. But if you want to initiate, the first step, I think it was also said yesterday, is to describe and define the OUV, which is the key of any nomination. Mr. Schmidt from ICOMOS Germany, the vice chair of the scientific committee of ICOMOS, is that right?
20th century.
20th century, okay, you're a real specialist. He has not yet been on the panel, unlike the rest of our panelists this afternoon. So I would like to give you the first word on, to comment on how you see the chances and how you would evaluate the ambition to put Erich Mendelsohn on the list. I think the idea behind the Erich Mendelsohn initiative is this architect deserves more attention. And one of the best solutions could be certainly inscription on the World Heritage List. this would give much more attention to his work. Please, Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Worbs. Well, as you say, Vice President of the International Scientific Committee of ICOMOS for the 20th Century Heritage, I can perhaps would like to offer sort of alternative view of the topic of 20th century heritage and the World Heritage List than we have perhaps heard in these last 2 days. The thing is that it has for a long time been an issue and a concern of both the World Heritage Committee and its advisory body ICOMOS that the World Heritage List, as it says in the operational guidelines, should be balanced, both balanced and representative. As you described, in the first years of the World Heritage List, inscription worked more or less by gut feeling. As you say, the people brought up the most wonderful places they knew, wonderful. But in the long run, that created quite a problem. Exactly that question of representativeness and balance. So I think it must have been about 20 years ago, ICOMOS worked out a document called Filling the Gaps, addressing exactly with facts and figures the situation of the World Heritage List, that quite a number of countries, cultures, historic eras, types of sites were overrepresented, sometimes dramatically overrepresented, whereas other fields of heritage, of highly significant situations were underrepresented or not represented at all. And there's a strategy that was based on that evaluation of the World Heritage List to sort of fill those gaps. And one tool that was developed and recommended to help make the World Heritage List both balanced and representative was historic thematic frameworks, which means in the case of the 20th century heritage that our committee, of which Jörg Haspel is a founding member, the ISC20C, together, well, in a very fruitful collaboration with the Getty Conservation Institute, produced a historic thematic framework for 20th century heritage, which under 10 headings, and this document can easily be found on the internet and downloaded as a PDF. Under 10 headings, it attempts to describe what sort of topics make up the 20th century, what has happened in the 20th century and produced sites of all sorts, which should be taken as the basis, the starting point for also World Heritage nominations. But of course, it's wider than just the World Heritage. It's also about producing awareness of 20th century heritage. But it can also should also be used as something as an eye opener to see, well, what is the 20th century all about, and what sort of sites could represent it, either individually or in groups, in transnational serial nominations and so forth. And some of these headings are perhaps scientific and technological development, or transportation systems and mass communications, or popular culture and tourism, or indeed war and its aftermath. Because, I mean, so much has happened in the 20th century, and that's the point. Much more than brilliant works of brilliant architects, of which, as we heard yesterday, already 5 or 6 groups of buildings of great architects have already found their way onto the World Heritage List. And so this is, well, there's a contradiction there. That's as far as I would go at this moment.
Okay, thank you. Frau Ringbeck, you have very long experience with the World Heritage of UNESCO, when Germany was a member, and before and after. What would be your comment?
Yeah, the best way is to fill in format 2B. That is always my recommendation. You know, for an international serial nomination, you have to fill in the application format for the tentative list, because each involved state party involved in a future common serial nomination has to submit such a tentative submission format, and it is number 2B for international serial nominations. And that in a certain way, that is a small summary, or it is a summary of the of the nomination dossier. You have to identify the criteria which are relevant for your nomination process. You have to write down in very short and in a very basic form what is the outstanding universal value. And we just heard Mr. Leo Schmidt explained that the World Heritage Program changed over the time. That means at the beginning of the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, the icons, more or less the icons, were listed, like the Yellowstone Park for the nature sites, and Gizeh and other huge, for instance, in Germany, it's Aachen-Kassriedel, which was as a Carolingian building, was inscribed on the World Heritage List. At the beginning, the idea was a little bit like the 8 wonders of the world. But as times goes by, the World Heritage Convention became the most popular program of the world. Everyone knows the World Heritage List, and the World Heritage List indeed is everyone knows the World Heritage List, but behind the list is an idea, and the idea of the World Heritage is, of course, international cooperation and an international responsibilities of the sites of outstanding universal value. We just heard that, I just said that the program changed, and the idea it went from icons to representatives of the best. So, and I think that was in the 1990s. And now we have 1,154 World Heritage sites. That is a lot. And more or less 50% of these sites are located in Europe. That means we have a disadvantage, because such a nomination this year would be one of the well-represented states in the world on the World Heritage List. So I think, therefore, we have to be very careful what should be nominated and who should nominate this convention. We just heard that nominations to the Memory of the World program, it's possible that NGOs put forward such nominations via the official channel, of course, but they could do that. But in the case of the World Heritage Program, I said, I underlined it yesterday, that is an international law, more or less. And the state party, or the state parties, they have to secure that the protection of the nominated World Heritage sites, that they have to protect them by laws, with their national laws, of course, but they are responsible for the protection and for the conservation of the sites, and that makes a difference to a program like the Memory of the World program. The United States and Israel, they are still members, state parties to the World Heritage Convention. They left the UNESCO in 2011, but in 1919, sorry, but in 19, but they are still state parties to the World Heritage Convention. They do not pay their contributions, but they still have the right to nominate. So that makes it, in this case, in this aspect, it makes the case easier. But anyway, it is often under discussion that nominations put forward by state parties which do not pay their contributions, such nominations should not be evaluated. But at the moment, it is still the case. That means the right to nominate is fixed in the convention, and the committee is not allowed to cut this right. The only possibility of the state parties or of the committee members is that they do not evaluate such nominations, but that never up to now it has not been happened. So that means the first step would be to fill in the nomination format, 2B, and I would recommend to set up a small writing group, maybe one expert from all the organizations, institutions which are present today and which were present yesterday. So one from the Getty and the other universities, but it should be a small group to fill it in. And to have and the aim should be to have a first draft of an outstanding universal value, because you need this. We heard a lot of the values of the archives, the values of the material which are preserved, even if the buildings were not erected, but I think that should be the first step. And what for me, I'm an art historian and specialized on architecture. For me, it would be really important to list all the buildings which survived, to check first, is the authenticity of the building and the integrity of the building still given? Because you can select the criteria between 1 and 6, that is up to you. But you cannot, you have to fulfill the conditions of integrity and authenticity. And if one of the buildings lost the authenticity or the integrity, then it does not make sense to put it in the series or to have it in the series. That, I think, should be the first step. And as I mentioned yesterday, the World Heritage list in the World Heritage Committee does not inscribe movable heritage in the list. That does not mean that the intangible heritage is not of great importance for the nomination dossier, but you have to link the intangible heritage with the built heritage. That sounds sometimes a little bit tricky, but if you get a little bit more used to the World Heritage Convention and how it worked, and in a certain way, what is the language and the words of the World Heritage Program, I think that that is not so difficult. It is a challenge to link the intangible attributes with the material substance, but I think in the end, it is possible to link them. And that's, you started, I think this conference, it was a good starting point. You should use the drive, set up a small writing group, and do the first draft for the statement of outstanding universal value. So that should be in the end. And I have to admit, I had the privilege in the privilege to attend and of attending all the international serial nominations since 2004 and the other 20 nominations in Germany, which were inscribed since 2001, I think. So, and sometimes it sounds a little bit difficult and a huge challenge, but in the end, you will see drafting a first OUV, the starting point. This OUV, the first draft, will never be the OUV which will be accepted from the World Heritage Committee, because writing a nomination process, a nomination dossier is a process. And this process needs experts, research experts from the research sides, experts, I think, from the monument protection authorities. And in the end, you need some experts who are familiar with the with the handicap of writing nomination dossiers. So I will end now.
Well, thank you very much. I think this was quite helpful. And I would like to give the floor to Eran Mordohovic. Maybe you can sketch what you think could be elements of the OUV of the works of Erich Mendelsohn.
Not sure I'm the
very easy question. Yes,
I'm not sure I'm the best,
but
expert.
Sketch. I mean, it's not. Yeah,
I think during the last year when we gathered via Zoom and virtual conference in July and preparation for this event, we have surfaced a few possible OUVs or scenarios for such elements, which might be a possible draft. We talked about, and I think they all surfaced also here in the last 2 days. There was the issue of exile, of the history of the first half of the 20th century, Mendelssohn as a Jew, spirituality. Remind me more. There were a lot. The technological innovation of Mendelssohn is this element, and I think one of the most maybe suitable scenarios is or OUVs is the adaptation of Mendelssohn's work to the places he had worked. In the way he connected to the local conditions, whether it's in Israel, it brought this ability or talent to adapt his architecture to the local conditions, to the local stone of Jerusalem, to the climate, which is very different than the climate in Berlin, where he worked before. And with that comes also innovation, how to solve those climatic and technological constraints and challenges. This is, I think, in the spirit of an international nomination or a project like that, it is one of the strongest points which can be discussed and finally drafted as a main motive. There is also, but this is connected to the intangible heritage, is the influence of music, the connection between the music and the architecture. So we had a lot of discussions and ideas. And within, as an initiative, I'm speaking now as an initiative, not as an ICOMOS Israel, we had more ideas than what we understand should be finally kind of funneled down into the essence. And we're playing with this idea. I think my partners in the initiative can also elaborate on that. For sure, the researchers and the people who are like Ita, which was here all the time, responding to the stories we heard about Mendelsohn. I think each one of us has his own perspective also, and that's also something that we have a little bit to put aside and think what is effective, what scenario, what OUV is effective in coming out from the research and from the personal preferences, and understanding what will be convincing and what will be, and I think Boguslav had put it wonderful yesterday, what will be, let's say, a consensus, a strong consensus that nobody would be able to say, because of this reason, we're not going to proceed with this nomination. That's also very important, what not to put it inside.
Okay, thank you. But bear in mind, please, as Frau Ringbeck said, that intangible values have to be reflected in non-movable monuments. So all these aspects you mentioned, music, Jewishness, you have to have a monument to which expresses.
Yes, that was also
will
discussed.
Be, I think, one of the intriguing issues to combine and to make this.
Of course,
evident.
we've talked about spiritual buildings, the synagogues,
for example, By the way, I mean, from the 2 days, I mean, I heard the words expressionism. Is this a specificity of the architecture of Mendelssohn? I mean, the Einstein Tower probably, other later works maybe less. Then Baroque was even mentioned, the curve. Well, I just quote some slogans I've heard during the 2 days. Well, maybe the great scholar of Erich Mendelsohn, Regina Stephan, can add some elements, some ideas to what has already been said by your neighbor, by Eran Mordohovic. Please.
Thank you. Well, I wrote a whole agenda down with all the informations that we got through this panel and all the lectures. I have to admit that I have to let it settle in my mind. There are very many important informations, and I feel like it is very not easy, but it is possible to operationalisieren, to make a process, to processing the whole thing by putting it into parts that we can really work on. And I definitely thank you, Frau Ringbeck. That was very helpful. I wrote down everything because I think that we can determine very specific characteristics of Mendelssohn. For me, it's the enormous ability to make of a kind of artistic drawing, because these are just very fast drawn sketches, and to bring them into drawings and into buildings that still reflect the original sketch. So this is, for me, this is a very important point, and I don't see it in another architect's work, but it is just one aspect. And I think we were already talking about how to go on now, and I think we will really establish a working group, writing down or collecting the different ideas. And in fact, I would like to ask the audience to write us an email to Mendelsohn at ICOMOS, please, to write down your ideas about the OUV, because I mean we heard a lot during the 2 days. We've got ideas, as Eran told, but maybe we can make a kind of a process of how to define it even better. For me, it's also a very important point, and I think this might be, but I don't know the gaps that you mentioned. Maybe it is also the importance of building for democracy, for a democratic society, for a community, which is an important aspect of Mendelssohn's buildings, because science is growing in the democratic Weimar Republic, and we've got the cinema as a huge common adventure when we're sitting with 1,800 people watching one film. It's the same. Factories which produce products that go into the entire world, and you got the synagogues bringing together the community of the congregation and so on. So maybe we can also think about this topic, which is something very important, and it is a reason why he had to leave Germany, because the democracy was gone in 1933, so there was no place anymore. And I think this is even stronger than the Jewish aspect, because the end of the democracy ends a whole important phase of the German history. And I was absolutely happy about the lectures this afternoon about the influence in America. I think this was very, very helpful to see how the American colleagues saw Mendelssohn, how it was published. And so we have to read all the papers again and really work on the results of this conference. And therefore, please write your ideas to Mendelsohn at ICOMOS.de, because I think it's very valuable to get your feedback.
Thank you very much. There's certainly influence of an architect can become part of OUV, but of course it's not only this, it must be more, of course. Well, after this first round in the plenary here on the desk, are there any comments from the floor? I see your hand, please. Can you tell your name when you speak?
Hello, my name is Mila Hacke. I'm an architectural photographer and curator of architectural exhibitions and also a member of ICOMOS. And to my mind came that the drive of this conference should be held and that you should get homework or have a small strategic group and then really be quite fast to start. So first is an OUV writing group and maybe another group taking the Corbusier text and copy and paste and making it better. So two different groups, and then nominating the buildings. And nominating the buildings, one could have many groups and working with different questions. So one question, authenticity and integrity. Another group could look at all different countries or all
different architecture is involved in the nominated group, and another group could ask normal people or connect like education, cultural education in the process. So like ask architecture students and schools and art projects with schools trying to get to find out whether there's nowadays or for the future. So if you do like a little bit of propaganda, put up some material for teachers and for trying to find some universities to help architects and art historians, and then also get their nomination list. And then you can try to compare all these nomination lists and find out which is in and which is out. And then the third idea is to open the process for the press and interdisciplinary process by coming up with something which sounds a bit funny, like a medal. Mendelsohn medal for whatever. Could be for design, could be for automotive technical museums. Which museum has the best early 20th century exhibitions about automotive mobility? What inspired the architecture of Mendelsohn? Or could be even something stupid like what design of a new car is the best and gets a medal, just to get some press and some investors in. So this is.
Thank you. Well, local communities have to be involved since the latest revision of the operational guidelines, as we have heard yesterday from Ms. Ringbeck. That's true. Now Professor Jörg Haspel has asked for the floor.
Thank you very much. And if I may give some comments or continue what Regina Stephan already told and what about she informed us. We have this Erich Mendelsohn Initiative Circle, which is growing and growing and growing, and which is also in the process of being diversified and of being qualified, because now we have new contributors in this meeting here and also on the screen. And we will try, I think, Regina, we will try to invite all of them and all of those who are interested to become member of this Erich Mendelsohn Initiative Circle, which is a very open format, which is totally unclear, but we try to involve all those who are interested. And we will come forward. We already have, of course, a list of Erich Mendelsohn buildings, and we already have also tried to qualify them with experts from these different 8 countries, with colleagues from ICOMOS, with art historians, architectural historians, urbanists, and so on. And so there are some questions open, and there are some evaluations and assessments have to be continued and have to be completed. But we have this survey, and we also have a kind of first proposal if they fulfill the requirements of authenticity and of integrity, and what should be done to fulfill it by measurement, and what is the state of protection, of legal protection. It's totally different in the different countries with the legal instruments which are available or which are used for it. So this process will go on. That's our interest, and everybody is invited to contribute and to join this. And the second aspect, Mila Hake mentioned, which is very important and which we did not yet consider as much as it should be necessary. That is the question of what is called the community involvement. And that's not only the involvement of the owners or of architects or of city planners, but that means really the community. And I see Mila Hake, I see Gunther Schlusche from the Gesellschaft für die Erforschung des Wirkens jüdischer Architekten deutscher Sprache. Thank you. I see Tamar Tuchler of the Preservation Society of Israel, of Heritage Sites in Israel. I saw Ben Buschfeld of the Triennale der Moderne. So if I see who is here in this meeting room and who is on the screen, there are representatives of communities, of society, which are not only art historians, they are also qualified, but they are committed to this whole issue, and they are very familiar with the work and the life and the influence of Erich Mendelsohn, as we thought. And our interest is to emphasize and to strong this support, because I think we have to create something like not a binational, but an international, a multinational network of communities who are cooperating, including those, as we saw in the film of Duki Dror, we saw the children, the girls in front of the pavilion. We should try to include them. We should try to include those from Alstein Borussia was here, Mrs. Korokowska. We can include them. So we have to create a second network, which is not the network of academia, but which is the network of community. And I think there are excellent preconditions to start this process now here. And the last aspect is, of course, we can ask the press, which heritage do you want, or what kind of heritage for future do you want? This is part of the communication process. So I only want to say that is one of our aims, is to go further. And I think we also will take over the recommendation which we received from Birgitta Ringbeck to think and to install something like an editor group or a writing group where this complex community of experts and of different responsibilities and of qualifications can cooperate and think about the submission format to fill it, and also to do comparative study. I have one question left to Leo Schmidt, because the historical thematic framework, there we have thematic aspects, and these are, most of them are typologies or uses or functions of building. So, but there is no oeuvre. There is not the most prominent architect of the 20th century, the most prominent structural engineer of the 20th century, or things like this. So how can we translate this, or how can we transfer it in a more systematical approach, which is not only led by the personality of an architect? If it is Alvar Aalto, if it is Josef Plečnik, if it is Le Corbusier, it doesn't matter. I think we need a different approach to discuss the contribution of Erich Mendelsohn. Maybe you can say something, and Birgitta Ringbeck, she already raised her hand.
No, just one information which came in my mind during the contribution of Regina. With the African World Heritage Fund is not preparing. It is it is identifying, that is the precise word for what is going on at the moment. They identify the architecture of the 1960s on the African continent, in order to get an idea or an approach for an international serial nomination of modern architecture in Africa. And as I mentioned, the Federal Foreign Office is funding a little bit this endeavor. And they have one title which was fascinating, which immediately convinced me. And this title for this endeavor is The Architecture of Independence. And when you told me the architecture of independence, so it is in the 1960s, most of the former colonial countries, they became independent, and now, I have saw there was a huge exhibition several years ago in the Vita Museum in Weil am Rhein, and all of these buildings which were presented in Weil are part of the inventory, of this inventory which is going on at the moment. But it is an amazing architecture. And for me, the title of this inventory, the architecture of the independence, was for me, it is a theme, and it is a narrative for such an international serial nomination on the African of African parties. But when you said, okay, we could think about the architecture of democracy, that could be such an idea or a title for an idea which you should use. And if you ask the audience to send an email with ideas, I would recommend to you send your ideas of such a title for such a nomination, or an undertitle, subtitle as well. And a third, well, not a third, but another recommendation would be to really look at the criteria. And for me, it's quite clear which criteria are relevant. You have to check whether criteria 1 is a masterpiece. And for instance, the Einstein tomb is, I think, of course, a masterpiece. Then a criteria 2, values and influences over a span of time. I'm sure that this criterion, that the criterion 2 would be relevant. And the last one of the 6 cultural criteria for me would be, of course, 5, typology. So, and if you make a structure a little bit, the request to the audience, what could be a meaningful title, how could Mendelsohn's buildings fulfill the conditions of the criteria 1, 2, and 4, and then you have a structure, and then the writing group would have a basis for starting the process.
Okay, thank you. You have been
I quite agree. That is an approach. I mean, in the thematic historic framework of our committee, one of the 10 fields has the title of Internationalization, New Nation States and Human Rights. Because that is, of course, a great 20th century topic, which is represented in many such places, some remarkable buildings by great architects. And that is the approach on which you can base OUV for sites. It's a property-based approach as opposed to a personality-based approach, which of course is well to be considered, because that's how the convention works. So if one focuses on Mendelssohn, one might conceive, that's a completely different approach, things like, I'm just talking off the top of my head, department stores or 20th century synagogues, and then have Mendelssohn works together, obviously, with works by other great architects. That would be far more compatible, far better compatible with with how the committee would like, as far as I can see, the list to develop, not by personalities and the different designs, how wonderful they may be, but by things which actually are representative of topics in a way, and then choose the best examples for that as a group, as a transnational serial nomination. Of course, one would have to collaborate with other people who are not particularly interested in Mendelssohn, but yeah, anyway, it's would be better in view of the convention and the desires of the committee.
Thank you. Well, in the new operational guideline, I think 112, which requires a provisional statement of OUV, it is also said that in this early stage, you may contact the World Heritage Center and also ICOMOS International, because this will be the body which in the end evaluates any nomination. So this is also, I think, maybe helpful. Anyway, we are running out of time, and I was informed that there are 2 more requests for the floor from here, and then we have one online. Yeah, please, and say your name at the beginning.
Hi, I'm Tamar Tuchler from Israel, from the Council for Conservation of Heritage Site, and I would like to continue, Jörg. It's very important to work now on a parallel, international parallel process, because while we're working on papers and decision about how to submit this list, things happen, and entrepreneurs try to change this building, and then we could not put them on the list. So our task now is to do the best that we can to influence and to raise the decision makers and to raise awareness. And I'm asking you that one of the things that we will create after this conference is to write some kind of paper, some kind of statement that we can use for the press, or to show, for example, the mayor of Jerusalem, if he knows that now his sites are potentially in a World Heritage Site. I think he will act different, or it will help us to act different. Then we can make some raise awareness of the parliament, and we can push, put some stress, pressure on the mayor and his colleague, and so on. So I think such a paper is very important. We have already some experience from the past that when we had to stop demolition of the concert hall in Tel Aviv, which was in the White City, we were working with Docomomo and with ICOMOS and 20th Century Committee. And the papers actually helped because they were published in a newspaper in New York. And the mayor of Tel Aviv saw it, and it really stopped the process. So we have many ideas of how to influence the public, but I think we need a statement. And when we see it's a statement made by professional from very important organization, very important position, it will make the difference. Thank you. And thank you for the beautiful organization.
Thank you. The next, Devin.
So we have a few comments from the chat, actually. The first from Kathleen James Chakraborty regarding the lecture from Spain. The situation in Spain is, I think, quite typical. Because of his influence in Spain, there's also an influence in South America, particularly Chile, and it extended all the way to Bombay and Shanghai. And this is from yesterday and today, two comments about Le Corbusier, also from Kathleen. First, comparing Mendelsohn with Le Corbusier helps for understanding how to make an effective nomination, but remember that in the 20s and early 30s, Mendelsohn was both better known and more influential. As Jörg has just pointed out, Mendelsohn built for specific places, but Le Corbusier often did not. And in general, she wanted to add, our central dilemma is that Mendelsohn himself turned away from what accounted for his greatest international influence. This is a huge part of why he is not as well remembered today as Le Corbusier, who changed his forms without changing his rhetoric or acknowledging the degree to which he had renounced his earlier work. We have to celebrate both aspects of his career. I personally think that his influence on commercial architecture worldwide is of enormous importance. And from Mr. Ulrich Knuffinke, he just added, in my opinion, more research on Mendelssohn's partners and the employees in his studios should be done to show his enormous impact in all the countries where he lived. And another question, a publication of the talks of yesterday and today would be very helpful for further steps. Is such publication planned? And he also has a suggestion for the title or the UV paper, Modernism as Architecture of Migrations. And also there's a comment from Mr. William Curtis. He raised his hands some minutes ago.
Thank you. Well, we are, I think, already beyond schedule. Well, I would like, certainly there are... Sorry? Okay, Mr. Curtis is waiting. Yeah, so this will be then the last intervention online, and I think we have to close because we will not finish this item, certainly, this afternoon.
I'm very sorry, an answer from our back office, from John Siesemer from ICOMOS Germany. So ICOMOS Germany intends to publish the papers of this conference in its series Journals of the German National Committee, ICOMOS Hefte des Deutschen Nationalkomitees. So a publication is planned.
Okay, that's good news. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the panelists and everybody who attended this late session. And I think there's a final exercise which Professor Haspel, I think you will take. Der ist aus. Ja. Yes. Ja, ich habe gesagt, Curtis.
Is he still available? So we can ask him. And William Curtis, it is his closing remark for today and for the 2 days, I think. Are you available? Yes.
Children. First of all, I would like to congratulate the organizers of this and the various contributors for in addition to the whole question of UNESCO recognition, opening so many new avenues of research and understanding on the figure of Erich Mendelsohn. Speaking personally about all of this, there was an earlier session on historiography, which implied somehow that, he was not anchored in a major way in the writings on 20th century architecture. Well, excuse me, I did write a book called Modern Architecture Since 1900, which placed him, first of all, in the context of Expressionism, then in the context of the 20s, the international style, and then in the spread of the modern architecture to Britain, and above all, in the last edition of the book, in a chapter called International, National, Regional, the Diversity of a New Tradition, the Extraordinary Works in British Mandate Palestine. So there is diversity, but behind all of this, I think there is the larger question of major works of architecture and their capacity to transcend their time, by the depth of their insight and by their resonance, where we no longer need to talk about modernism, but just about architecture in the most general sense. And from the point of view of a historian, which is not necessarily the point of view of a committee trying to decide how to recognize this or that or the other thing about a particular work, the important thing is the, let's say, highest possible quality of Mendelssohn's works. And works which indeed automatically, by the very definition of great architecture, combine the intangible values, the spiritual values, which were held dear, not simply Jewish, but in fact in a more general sense by Mendelssohn, and their translation through the sketch, through the intuition, into the process and into the final object. And you can decide for yourselves which of those buildings achieve that. I personally would back a horse like the Hadassah, very strongly indeed, except it's probably been knocked around a little bit. But Einstein Tower, and so you could go on and go forth. But I think if one slips into the other kind of definition, which was very well pointed out, that there's a more populist mood at the moment about what is, let's say, cultural heritage. At that point, there is a risk of slipping off the definition of high architectural quality and getting into a sort of representative idea of culture. And I personally would oppose that very strongly. Just because the building is democratic or because it has a lot of people in a cinema, to me, this is not automatically of value. The value is, I think, and speaking now as a historian of architecture, in its architectural values, and architectural values can transcend on a certain level other kinds of values. And if one bothers to talk about Mendelsohn at all, it's because of that. Otherwise, we wouldn't discuss anything else about him. But anyway, absolute congratulations to everybody involved in this marvelous thing. It's been wonderful sitting in southwestern France, listening to you all. I'm sorry to have spoken too much, but it's out of absolute enthusiasm for what you're doing. And of course, for the wonderful figure of Mendelssohn. I first discovered Mendelssohn's work at the age of 20 when I went to see the Bexhill Pavilion in the pouring rain. So thanks again. And I hope this all goes forward in the ways that you all want.
Thank you very much for the greetings and for the comments and for accompanying us these 2 days from France here in Berlin. It was very helpful for us and for the whole meeting here. Now we have, or I would like to thank Mr. Worbs for chairing this moderation. I would like to thank all of the participants, of the panelists here on the floor for their comments and also for their recommendation. And we now have planned, or I have asked, two experts to recapitulate and to make some closing recommendations which can continue and which will confirm some of the recommendations we already had here on the table, on the floor, and maybe which will also expand and broaden our range of view. One of them is Katarina Piotrowska from Poland, and the other one is Borislav Schmigin. May I ask you to come and to give your main comment and main recommendations how to go further. And Boguslav, you are already mentally prepared to follow, yes?
Wow, what a challenge. Yes, and what a responsibility. Well, the first, and I think the utmost recommendation is to keep going and find a way to keep the initiative alive. I was, in addition to what was said, all the practical advice by Birgitta Ringbeck from her own experience, I would also add one additional thing, which could be taken by national committees of ICOMOS to do a continuous inventory of Mendelssohn architecture in different countries. Just to look at what is there, in what state the buildings are, what are the legal protection and other things as well, because we may look at architectural heritage slightly differently in different countries. And also that would be very important, a kind of background information for the dossier and then for the justification. So that would be very important to be done, along with thinking about the outstanding universal value. And the other thing which I just thought about when there was a question about the involvement of communities. Me, myself, I would like very much to join Facebook or any other fan page of Erich Mendelsohn heritage or something like that. So maybe using social media wouldn't be a bad idea to make Mendelssohn heritage popular and also to communicate with in other world than the strictly professional. So that's what I wanted to add. In addition to what was said, all the recommendations were very sound and that they may take us further with the initiative. So just to repeat the first one, let's keep going. Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. And it was a great pleasure to be here and honor to me. Thank you.
Thanks. Dear colleagues, Professor Haspel asked me for 3 short conclusions, of course, based on the World Heritage System. So first remark would be general, and being so close to that legacy, being so close to the Erich Mendelsohn, we started to see the personality with his relation, with his relatives, with his letters, and trying to inscribe that heritage on the World Heritage List, we should concentrate on the architectural works. So it means that for a while, we have to step back and to concentrate on the architecture. That's one very important point. Obviously, knowing everything about his legacy, about his connections. But for a while, we have to step back because that's the key issue. The second, that would be the strategic remark. Obviously, we should discuss mainly and starting about the OUV, because this is the only criterion inscription on the World Heritage List. It means we are talking about the values. For the values, we need criteria. Without criterion, we don't know what we're doing. We need the reference group in order to make the comparison. Because we don't have those elements, it is not possible, practically, it is not possible to select the particular buildings without that. It means that we should start with the formulating that OUV, and then we will see other elements which architectural works could be attached to that OUV. Then we have to check authenticity, integrity management, and so on. So that's very important. And finally, the operational free elements. So absolutely, we have to create a very small editorial group to formulate on 3-4 pages, no more, the draft of the OUV. That's the first group. The second one, it would be very useful having such a beautiful collection of scientists which know very well the legacy and all relation of Erich Mendelsohn, to prepare also the comparative study. It means publication describing his works in the context of the whole epoch. Because we need that document also. And that's the work for the scientists. And that must be done parallelly, then to compare one document with the second document. And thirdly, we should define on that stage which countries could contribute to that preparation, not sites, not managers, not personalities, but countries, because that initiative, that business is on the state party level. So that would be useful. We should take into account that. If we would be able to do that after that conference, that would be very practical results. Not only the conclusion that we have to organize the next conference after the half a year to discuss what to do. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna and Boguslav. And may I ask, Regina, you mentioned that you have written 2 days long and you want to let it settle, but maybe you can now confirm and add some aspects which are important from your point of view, which should be kept here and which can be used as a kind of message for the future and for the planning before we come to the final round and to the Thanksgiving.
What a task. Well,
but if there is anybody who can fulfill this task, it's you, I'm sure.
Still more. Well, I think we had an enormous input. And I absolutely appreciate the two different sides and perspective from the institutional side, so from UNESCO, ICOMOS, and the monuments institutions and the scientists. And I think this is something very particular and very valuable. And our task is now to bring this together to have a joint initiative. And we had a discussion already concerning the question of the Memory of the World program, that we would like to bring the informations or the collections of the Getty Research Institute and the Kunstbibliothek into one database, and to be efficient and also quick as well, and use what we've already got. We would like to enlarge the EMA side with all the documents in the two collections, in order to make them more accessible and also visible what is there, in order to help the scientists to work on the different projects. And I think we need to look very closely to the lectures that we heard. I learned a lot during these lectures, and we have to really look them, use the information that were in the lectures in order to build up our cosmos, to have more information about the influence and Mendelsohn and the literature and on. We'll have a meeting very soon, because I also believe that we need to use the power that is in this room and was in our middle during these last days, in order to bring this nomination forward. And I will prepare an agenda and for the next meeting, and we will have to meet in Zoom again, but thanks God we have Zoom, which makes it possible to have this conference within less than a year. And we will really look at the results, build the different groups, editorial group, the comparative studies, and we are really inviting the audience in presence here in Berlin, and also the audience on the web, to contribute to this different groups, in order to bring the best together and bring this nomination process on the track. So there is a lot to do, and we will meet again in November, hopefully in Haifa, where we also will hear all the case studies and the risk reports. This is something that we did not do during these days, because we had such interesting abstracts. We clustered them, and we thought that we would need the lectures about the emigration and the Jewishness and the spirituality, and naturally the whole process of nominating a World Heritage Site by the experts from ICOMOS and UNESCO. And in the second part of this symposium, we will be more based on the objects. This is something that maybe one or the other might have missed during these last days. But this is already which way to go and which buildings to nominate when we then have hopefully a very good idea for the OUV. But for me, this has been went out of the fog, became more clear, and will be the result, or we will work on it during the next months, so that we can present an idea or a formulated phrase or terms in the conference in November in Haifa. So since it's my last word, I would like to thank also very much to everybody who joined us, and also the team that did an enormous job during these 2 days. It was a very, very nice cooperation here. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for this summarizing recommendation, and to let us know the plans of the Erich Mendelsohn initiative. And there is only one remark, because I see that Tamara is here and that Günter Schlusche are here, and it is easier to communicate if you are in the same room and if you are in a present meeting than online. Please grasp the opportunity to talk together. And maybe the question of heritage at risk, of an heritage alert of Mendelssohn's buildings which are under threat or which are under pressure in the United States, in Israel, which are not in the best condition here in Germany. Maybe this is an issue which could be discussed and which could be also be used to address and to ask for support of media and also for others. I think it's a very important aspect, because we cannot discuss and initiate a World Heritage nomination without the objects, and the object should be in the best condition of integrity and authenticity. And if they are endangered, it's not easier to, as we know. So at the end, I would like to thank very much our host here, the Architektenkammer Berlin, Mrs. Carpati and Ms. Mosemann, and also James Connors, who was responsible for this wonderful catering. So we were always very well provided. And I would like, of course, Theresa Keilhager, the president of the Chamber of Architects, and the vice president of the Chamber of Architects, Ayhan Erilmaz, who yesterday was the host in the cinema and who is also a member of the board of ICOMOS Germany. Secondly, I would like the interpreter, Lamotte, Benedikt Vogt, James Müller, and the team which was involved in the preparation of this meeting. For us, it was an experiment. And I'm very happy, glad, and satisfied that it worked, and that we, not only that we survived, but that we succeeded with this experiment. Thank you very much. And thank you also to the colleagues. And I would like to thank Christos Akrivoulis and Sasha Grunow for the evening yesterday in the Click Cinema. And a very special thanks to the Wüstenrot Foundation and to Philipp Kurz. Without the Wüstenrot Foundation and without Philipp Kurz, we would not have been able to organize this meeting as a hybrid meeting here, but we would have be satisfied with a Zoom meeting or something like this, and that's totally different. So I hope that we can convince the Wüstenrot Stiftung to continue in accompanying at least our initiative, because this is a very important partner, not only for the Erich Mendelsohn initiative, but also for the heritage, for the built heritage of Erich Mendelsohn, which is one of the main issues and of the main topics of the foundation. Thirdly, I would like to thank our partners. Of course, the UNESCO Commission of Germany, Mrs. Meißner, and best regards and many thanks to Mr. Luxscheiter, and also to the Israel National Commission for UNESCO in Jerusalem, and our local partners, Landesdenkmalamt Berlin with Christoph Rauhut and Sabine Ambrosius, the Brandenburg Landesamt für Denkmalpflege, Archäologisches Landesmuseum mit Thomas Drachenberg and Christine Onnen, and the art library of the Foundation of Prussian Heritage and of the State Museums with Moritz Mull. I'm really very impressed and glad that he was here personally today, yesterday, and he also accompanied us and was with us on Sunday. And we hope that this kind of support will be continued in the future. And Maristella, our many thanks to the Getty Research Institute, to you and to Mrs. Miller for the support we had. Also for the speakers we had partially from Getty. I hope that these two institutions, that they can cooperate, that they can offer a common platform which could also be useful for our World Heritage idea and initiative. So many thanks to you, and many thanks to Docomomo, which is our partner here in Germany. Not only in Germany, Jadwiga Urbanek was here. She is the chief or the president of ICOMOS Poland as well, from Wrocław, and to Andrea Jüten for chairing this session today, and also for contributing in the chat and today with comments. And I would like to thank the citizen groups, as already mentioned, the Gesellschaft, I have written it now down, Günter Schlusse, the Gesellschaft zur Erforschung des Lebens und Wirkens deutschsprachiger Architekten, and also the Triennale der Moderne, and Tamar Tuchler for the Society for the Preservation of Heritage Sites in Israel. I found it very fine, and I'm very glad that not only the academia, not only scientists and archivists were here, but that also these societies are represented here. And I would like to thank all the moderators, all the chairs, all the speakers, all the guides on Sunday, and all the panelists for coming here to Berlin or to participate online in this meeting. Of course, our chair, Mr. Worbs, the ambassador for UNESCO for the Federal Republic in Germany, and for the moderators from abroad, that was Katarzyna Piotrowska and Eran Mordohovic, for coming here and attending this meeting. And last, not least, many thanks to the audience for joining us, for discussing with us, for listening with us, and for your patience and for your understanding when sometimes we had some repair works to do and to organize the whole issue. So I hope you enjoyed your stay here, and you will, and our offers and our program we had in Berlin. We wish you a safe and healthy journey back, and we hope to meet you again soon and in peace. Thank you very much.
You also drove the locomotive, not only the driver. So it's really, you thank so many people, but we have to thank you for being there and leading this thing. Thank you.